In the scorching sands of North Africa, one battle decided the fate of an empire, El Alamein, where Rommel's desert dream met Montgomery's iron will. It was the battle that changed the fate of the Desert War, the clash where the shifting sands of North Africa carried the weight of global destiny. At El Alamein, in October 1942, two armies faced one another across barren plains and endless dunes. One, the Afrika Korps under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, whose maneuvers had humiliated the Allies for months. The other, a battered yet determined British Eighth Army, now under the command of General Bernard Montgomery, who promised not another retreat, not another inch of ground surrendered. For both sides, El Alamein was more than a battle. It was a last gamble, a turning point, a struggle where the outcome would decide whether the Axis could reach the Suez Canal and threaten the very lifeline of the British Empire, or whether the tide of war in North Africa would finally begin to turn. This was no quick skirmish, no fleeting clash of patrols in the desert. It was a grinding confrontation of tanks and artillery, of infantry dug into the sand, of minefields stretching like iron fences across the battlefield, and of supply lines stretched to breaking point. Under the blistering sun and freezing desert nights, men fought, bled, and endured, surrounded by an unforgiving landscape where even survival was a battle in itself. Waves of attacks surged and faltered, shells thundered through the desert air, and the roar of engines filled the horizon as tanks locked horns in duels that would decide the course of an empire. The Battle of El Alamein was not only a tactical victory, but a moment of morale, a spark of hope in a war that had seen too many defeats. Churchill himself would later declare, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." It was here, in the desert, that the myth of Axis invincibility cracked, and the long road to Allied triumph began. So join me now as we retrace every moment of this pivotal campaign, from the desperate days of retreat to the thunder of Montgomery's counteroffensive. Get comfortable, settle in for the full story, and as always, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time of day it is for you. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments as we dive deep into the turning point of the Desert War, the Battle of El Alamein. The North African campaign of World War II was unlike any other front, a vast battlefield of sand, heat, and horizon where armies clashed across distances measured in hundreds of miles. In 1942, this theatre had become one of the most critical arenas of the war, where the ambitions of Hitler and Mussolini collided with the determination of the British Empire. The stakes were immense. Control of Egypt, the Suez Canal, and the vital oil routes of the Middle East. The desert itself became both an ally and an enemy, swallowing men, machines, and supplies in its endless dunes. Dust storms blinded gunners, searing heat immobilized tanks, and the sheer scale of the terrain tested the limits of logistics. Unlike the mud and forests of Europe, here war unfolded under an unforgiving sun, with no shelter but what soldiers could build. Armies were not just fighting each other, but the desert itself, where water was as precious as ammunition. In this harsh environment, mobility, endurance, and supply determined victory. By mid-1942, all eyes turned to this barren landscape as its battles took on global significance. For the Axis, North Africa was a chance to strike at the British Empire's lifeline. Hitler's ally, Benito Mussolini, had dreamed of reviving a Roman Empire across the Mediterranean, and North Africa was central to his vision. Yet Italian failures in 1940 had forced German intervention, leading to the arrival of Erwin Rommel and his famed Afrika Korps. By 1942, Rommel had become a legend, his daring maneuvers and lightning strikes earning him the nickname the Desert Fox. His victories at Cyrenaica and Gazala had shattered British defences, pushing the Eighth Army back in disorder. With the fall of Tobruk in June 1942, Rommel seized vast quantities of supplies and threatened to break into Egypt. Now Alexandria and the Nile Valley lay open, vulnerable to the Axis spearhead. The possibility of losing Egypt sent shockwaves through London, raising fears that the jewel of the empire might fall. Rommel's advance was more than a military campaign, it was a knife aimed at Britain's heart. The Axis objective was not only Egypt itself, but the Suez Canal, a vital artery connecting Britain to its empire in India, the Middle East, and beyond. Control of the canal meant control of the Mediterranean's lifeline, shortening supply routes and cutting Allied access to vital resources. If Rommel broke through to Cairo, the consequences would reverberate across continents. Britain would be forced to reroute its supplies around the Cape of Good Hope, a detour of thousands of miles. At the same time, Axis control of Egypt could threaten oil fields in the Middle East, resources desperately needed by Hitler's war machine. For Mussolini, victory promised prestige and legitimacy, restoring Italian honor after humiliations earlier in the war. For Hitler, it would open the possibility of linking North Africa with German forces advancing into the Caucasus. In Berlin, planners imagined a grand arc of conquest, stretching from the Volga to the Nile. The desert, once peripheral, now became central to global strategy. For the British, the defense of Egypt was a matter of survival. The country was more than a colonial possession. It was the gateway to the empire and the anchor of Britain's global power. Losing Egypt would mean not only the loss of the Suez Canal, but the collapse of British influence in the Middle East. It would endanger Palestine, threaten the oil-rich fields of Iraq and Iran, and expose East Africa to renewed Axis advances. British prestige, already shaken by defeats in Europe and Asia, would suffer another catastrophic blow. London knew that morale at home and across the empire depended on holding Egypt at all costs. The Eighth Army, battered and demoralized, stood as the last line of defense between Rommel and Alexandria. Churchill himself declared that Egypt must be defended, no matter the cost in men or material. In Cairo, nerves frayed as civilians prepared for the possibility of evacuation. The defense of Egypt was not just a battle, it was a test of Britain's endurance. The desert, however, was no ordinary battlefield. Its vast openness demanded a new kind of warfare, where tanks became the dominant weapon, maneuvering like ships in an ocean of sand. Supply lines stretched across endless wastes, vulnerable to attack and sabotage. Armies depended on convoys of trucks carrying water, fuel, and ammunition, often targeted by enemy aircraft. Navigation was a challenge, with few landmarks to guide movement and compasses often thrown off by local conditions. Sand-clogged engines wore down weapons and blinded soldiers in sudden storms. Heat during the day could reach unbearable extremes, only to be replaced by chilling cold at night. Soldiers fought not only the enemy but exhaustion, thirst, and disease. Entire campaigns hinged on logistics, with armies halted not by firepower but by lack of fuel. The desert made warfare both mobile and precarious, demanding ingenuity from commanders and resilience from troops. At El Alamein, these conditions would shape every decision. By the summer of 1942, the lines of battle had reached a narrow strip of desert along the Egyptian coast, near a small railway station called El Alamein. Here the desert narrowed between the Mediterranean Sea to the north and the impassable Qattara Depression to the south. This geography created a natural bottleneck where Rommel's mobility was constrained and the British could finally stand firm. Unlike the open expanses of Libya, Here there was no room for sweeping flanking maneuvers. The battlefield compressed into a front where minefields, artillery, and infantry could hold against tanks. The British recognized the advantage and began fortifying the line, determined to make their stand. For Rommel, El Alamein was both a challenge and an opportunity, a barrier that had to be broken to reach Alexandria. The geography of this place would transform the course of the campaign. The desert had delivered a stage perfectly suited for a decisive confrontation. The world would soon learn its name. The campaign in North Africa was not fought by Germans and Britons alone. Across the desert, soldiers from Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, India, and other parts of the Commonwealth fought side by side under the British flag. Their contributions were vital, their sacrifices immense, as they braved the same heat and danger far from home. The Axis, too, relied on Italian divisions, many of them poorly equipped, yet still enduring the hardships of the Desert War. This was a multinational conflict, stretching across cultures and languages, yet united by the brutal reality of survival in the sand. For the soldiers, camaraderie was forged in shared suffering, the thirst of the desert, the roar of Stuka dive bombers, the grinding battle of attrition. Each army carried with it the hopes of distant nations. For Britain it was the defense of empire, for Germany the dream of conquest, for Italy the pursuit of prestige. The desert became a meeting place of global ambitions, where fate was decided under the sun. As 1942 unfolded, the stage was set for one of the most important battles of the war. The Axis, driven by Rommel's audacity, stood at the very edge of Egypt, poised to strike at Alexandria and the Suez Canal. The British, under new leadership, prepared to hold their ground at El Alamein, where geography favored defense and reinforcements were gathering. The desert, harsh and unrelenting, promised to test the strength of both armies. This was more than a clash of men and machines. It was a struggle for the future of the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and the British Empire itself. The outcome would shape the course of the war, lifting one side's hopes while dashing the other's dreams. In the heat and dust, the fate of nations converged. Every soldier who dug a trench, who drove a tank, who carried a rifle, felt the weight of history on their shoulders. The world was watching the desert. The desert was ready for El Alamein. The Desert War before El Alamein was defined by sweeping maneuvers, sudden reversals, and battles fought across distances so vast that armies seemed to vanish into the horizon. In late 1941, the British Eighth Army had driven Rommel back into Libya during Operation Crusader, regaining ground and lifting the siege of Tobruk. But by early 1942, the pendulum of war had swung again, and the Afrika Korps was preparing a renewed offensive. Rommel, despite shortages of fuel and supplies, planned bold moves, relying on speed and surprise to outmaneuver his adversaries. His reputation as the Desert Fox was already taking shape, built on his instinct for exploiting weaknesses. The British, confident after earlier successes, underestimated the resilience of his forces. What followed would prove that North Africa was a theatre where fortunes could change overnight. The campaign along the Gazala line became the crucible for Rommel's legend. It was here that the road to Tobruk, and ultimately El Alamein, began. The Gazala line stretched for miles across the Libyan desert, fortified by the British with minefields and defensive boxes designed to halt Rommel's advance. Montgomery had not yet arrived. Command rested with General Neil Ritchie under the oversight of Auchinleck. The British positions appeared strong on paper, anchored on the coast and supported by armour reserves. But Rommel saw opportunities hidden in the sand. In May 1942 he launched Operation Venezia, a daring flanking manoeuvre that would become one of his most famous operations. He swung his Afrika Corps in a wide arc around the southern flank of the British line, threading his columns through the desert in a move both audacious and risky. The maneuver placed his forces deep behind British positions, sowing confusion and stretching their defences. The desert once again favoured mobility and deception over static defence. Rommel had gambled, and in the days ahead he would prove why he was feared as a master of desert warfare. The fighting at Gazala quickly descended into chaos, with swirling tank battles erupting across the open desert. Rommel's armoured spearhead, including the formidable Panzer III and IV tanks, clashed with British Grant's Crusaders and newly arriving American-built Shermans. Dust clouds obscured the battlefield, and visibility was often reduced to a few hundred meters, creating confusion for both sides. The Afrika Corps relied on discipline and coordination, while British forces often struggled with communication breakdowns. German anti-tank guns, particularly the dreaded 88 mm, proved devastating against Allied armour. Rommel himself moved constantly along the battlefield, directing operations from the front, inspiring his men with his presence. For days the British attempted to counter his thrust, but their forces became fragmented, their armoured brigades committed piecemeal. Rommel pressed his advantage, knowing that speed and relentless pressure could unravel the entire line. By early June, the British were on the defensive, their Gazala line crumbling. The stage was set for a disaster of historic proportions. As the battle intensified, Rommel executed a maneuver that would later be called the Cauldron. His forces, encircled by British minefields and strongpoints, appeared trapped and vulnerable. Yet instead of retreating, Rommel dug in, using the defensive boxes to his advantage, and funneling British attacks into killing zones covered by artillery and anti-tank guns. The British launched repeated assaults, but their tanks were cut down in waves, burning wrecks littering the desert floor. Inside the Cauldron, Rommel's troops endured shortages and relentless pressure, but his leadership kept morale high. Meanwhile, Axis supply convoys pushed through, sustaining the position against the odds. The British, convinced they were crushing Rommel, instead bled themselves white against his defences. It was a masterclass in deception and endurance, a reversal of fortune that would soon open the road to Tobruk. The Cauldron broke the back of British resistance at Gazala. Rommel had turned entrapment into triumph. With the Gazala line shattered, Rommel turned his eyes on Tobruk, the key port that had resisted him for so long. In 1941, the fortress city had withstood a grueling siege, becoming a symbol of defiance for the British Empire. But in June 1942, the defenders were unprepared for the speed and ferocity of Rommel's renewed assault. On June 20th, Axis forces launched a coordinated attack, striking from multiple directions with armour, infantry and air support. The British garrison, commanded by General Klopper, was overwhelmed in less than 48 hours. Rommel's troops stormed the defences, capturing vast stockpiles of food, fuel and ammunition. The fall of Tobruk was a stunning victory, yielding 33,000 prisoners and delivering desperately needed supplies to the Axis. Churchill called it one of the heaviest blows I can recall during the war. For Rommel it was his crowning achievement, earning him promotion to Field Marshal. For the British it was a humiliation that shook morale across the Empire. The loss of Tobruk had profound consequences for the British in North Africa. Not only did it strip them of a vital supply base, but it also exposed the road to Egypt and Alexandria. Rommel, flush with success, and resupplied by the spoils of Tobruk, pressed his advantage. His forces surged eastward, driving deep into Egyptian territory. The British, stunned by the sudden collapse, began a desperate retreat across the desert. Units withdrew in disarray, abandoning equipment and vehicles to avoid encirclement. Cairo prepared for evacuation, with officials burning sensitive documents and civilians bracing for invasion. The threat to the Suez Canal was immediate and terrifying. In London, Churchill rushed reinforcements and new leadership to stabilize the front. The collapse from Gazala to Tobruk to Egypt marked one of the darkest chapters for the Allies. The desert had swallowed another British defense, and Rommel seemed unstoppable. Yet Rommel's triumph carried hidden costs that would soon catch up with him. His rapid advance stretched his supply lines to the breaking point, leaving fuel and ammunition convoys vulnerable to Allied air and naval attacks. The further east he pushed, the more precarious his position became. The British retreat was chaotic, but it was also buying time. General Auchinleck, realizing the gravity of the situation, assumed direct command of the 8th Army, determined to halt Rommel before he reached Cairo. British engineers worked frantically to prepare defensive positions near El Alamein, where geography offered a natural choke point. Though demoralized, British troops regrouped, their desperation hardening into resolve. The Axis, by contrast, grew exhausted, their vehicles worn down by constant movement, and their fuel tanks often running dry. Rommel's boldness had brought him to the edge of triumph, but also to the brink of overextension. The sands of fortune were beginning to shift. The desert was not done shaping destiny. By July 1942, the story of Gazala and Tobruk had become legend, both for the victors and the vanquished. For Rommel, it was the high point of his career, proof of his brilliance and daring in the Desert War. For the British, it was a catastrophe, a reminder that underestimating the Desert Fox came at a terrible price. The fall of Tobruk shook the confidence of commanders and politicians alike, leaving Churchill in despair and his generals scrambling for answers. Yet within the defeat lay the seeds of recovery, for the British had finally recognized the scale of the challenge they faced. The desert, with its vast distances and unforgiving climate, had punished mistakes mercilessly, but it had also provided one final line of defense, El Alamein. Here the fate of Egypt, the Suez Canal, and the British Empire in the Middle East would be decided. The long retreat was ending. A new chapter of defiance was about to begin in the sands of El Alamein. Erwin Rommel had already become a legend by the summer of 1942, admired even by his enemies for his daring maneuvers and seemingly uncanny ability to strike where least expected. Known as the Desert Fox, he embodied speed, surprise, and audacity, commanding respect not only from his men but also from his opponents. Rommel was rarely found in the safety of a headquarters tent. Instead, he was on the move in his command vehicle, scanning the horizon with binoculars and issuing orders directly on the battlefield. His leadership style was personal and hands-on, inspiring his troops with his presence and his willingness to share the dangers they faced. He thrived on improvisation, turning crises into opportunities, and often defied orders from Berlin or Rome when they clashed with his instincts. This independence, while risky, gave him a flexibility that stunned British commanders. Yet behind his reputation was also a man stretched to his limits, commanding an army constantly on the edge of supply shortages. Rommel's victories had made him a household name in Germany and abroad, elevating him into a myth of invincibility. In the desert, he was both commander and symbol, the spearhead of Axis ambitions in Africa. Rommel's charisma and boldness masked the harsh realities of his position. The Afrika Korps was a mixed force of Germans and Italians, often uneven in quality and equipment, yet he managed to forge them into an effective fighting machine. His relentless energy drove his staff and subordinates to exhaustion, as he demanded constant readiness and rapid maneuvers. He possessed an intuitive grasp of the desert, treating it like an open chessboard where speed and surprise outweighed brute force. His tactical brilliance was undeniable, but his strategic vision sometimes faltered, particularly when it came to logistics. Rommel often pushed his army beyond its means, advancing faster than fuel and ammunition could follow. His defiance of higher command earned him admiration from his troops, but suspicion from superiors in Berlin. To the Allies he was a formidable adversary, feared for his unpredictability. To his men, he was a leader worth following into the harshest conditions. Rommel's reputation loomed so large that it often shaped Allied strategy, as much psychological as tactical. He was a commander who lived by instinct, but instinct alone could not win a war. Into this storm of defeat and uncertainty on the British side came a new figure, General Bernard Montgomery. In August 1942, Churchill dismissed General Auchinleck and appointed Montgomery to command the 8th Army. Montgomery arrived with a clear vision and a personality as forceful as Rommel's, but utterly different in style. Where Rommel thrived on improvisation, Montgomery insisted on meticulous preparation. He was not a gambler, but a planner, believing that battles should be won before they began through overwhelming strength, discipline, and careful coordination. His very presence brought a new sense of confidence, for Montgomery was not only a strategist but also a master of morale. He addressed his troops directly, instilling in them the belief that victory was not only possible but inevitable. His arrival marked a turning point, replacing defeatism with determination. Montgomery's mission was not simply to halt Rommel, but to reverse the tide of the Desert War. He came to El Alamein with a plan as deliberate as Rommel's was daring. The clash of their approaches would decide the fate of North Africa. Montgomery was a man of contrasts, brilliant in planning, sometimes abrasive in personality. He did not inspire affection in the same way Rommel did, but he commanded respect through discipline and clarity of purpose. He reorganized the 8th Army, restoring order after months of retreat and chaos. He insisted on strict lines of communication, ensuring that every soldier understood the plan and their role in it. Unlike Rommel, who took reckless chances, Montgomery believed in applying overwhelming force at a chosen point, ensuring no room for surprise. He was cautious, sometimes criticized for moving slowly, but his method was designed to minimize risk and maximize certainty. To his men, this meant fewer costly mistakes and more trust in their leadership. To his critics, it meant rigidity and a lack of daring. Yet in 1942, after the disasters of Gazala and Tobruk, what the British needed was not audacity, but steadiness. Montgomery provided exactly that. His approach turned a broken army into a force capable of facing Rommel head-on. The personalities of Rommel and Montgomery could not have been more different, and yet their reputations grew in parallel across the desert sands. Rommel, the gambler, thrived on speed and instinct, willing to risk everything on a bold maneuver. Montgomery, the planner, sought certainty, building his battles brick by brick until victory was assured. Rommel's genius lay in his ability to inspire men to do the impossible. Montgomery's strength lay in making the impossible unnecessary through preparation. One fought like a fox, darting and deceiving, the other like a builder, methodical and unyielding. Their armies reflected their commanders. The Afrika Korps, lean, aggressive and daring. The 8th Army, structured, methodical and increasingly confident. To soldiers on both sides, it felt like more than a clash of armies. It was a clash of philosophies. Each man became the embodiment of his side's approach to war. The desert was their arena, and El Alamein would be their duel. History would forever bind their names together. Rommel's health and circumstances also created a stark contrast with Montgomery's rise. By mid-1942, Rommel was suffering from exhaustion and illness, Strained by the pressures of constant campaigning, his supply situation deteriorated with each advance, as Allied naval power choked his lifelines across the Mediterranean. He fought brilliantly, but often without the resources needed to sustain his victories. Montgomery, by contrast, inherited an army being reinforced by American equipment and growing logistical support. He could rely on a steady stream of tanks, aircraft, and supplies, giving him the means to execute his deliberate strategies. Rommel's brilliance was being eroded by scarcity. Montgomery's caution was empowered by abundance. The Desert Fox was running on instinct and reputation, while his opponent built his strength day by day. Their duel was not only of minds but of circumstances. One commander was reaching the limits of what daring could achieve. The other was preparing to show what planning could deliver. The propaganda machines of both sides elevated Rommel and Montgomery into near-mythical figures. German media portrayed Rommel as the invincible commander, a symbol of German prowess even when fighting against overwhelming odds. British propaganda transformed Montgomery into the savior of the Eighth Army, the man who would finally bring victory to the desert. Soldiers carried these images with them into battle, fighting not only for their nations but for the reputations of their leaders. The rivalry between Rommel and Montgomery became part of the larger narrative of World War II, a story of two men whose styles embodied the struggle between Axis daring and Allied discipline. Their names appeared in newspapers around the world, inspiring headlines and shaping public perception of the Desert War. Yet for the men in the trenches, the reality was less mythic: hunger, thirst, fear, and survival. Still, the aura of their commanders mattered, giving meaning to the suffering. In the desert, leadership was not abstract, it was life or death. By the time the two men faced each other at El Alamein, their reputations were well established, but their strategies had yet to be tested against each other on such a decisive scale. Rommel believed in the power of surprise and rapid thrusts, hoping to break through the Alamein line before Montgomery could fully prepare. Montgomery believed in patience and preparation, determined to build overwhelming force before striking. The battlefield would decide which philosophy could prevail in the unforgiving desert. The men under their command, weary from months of struggle, carried into battle the spirit of their leaders. For Rommel's troops, it was the faith that their fox-like commander could outwit any opponent. For Montgomery's men, it was the certainty that their general's plan would not fail. El Alamein became more than a clash of armies. It was the testing ground for two commanders' visions of war. The outcome would echo across the world. The Desert Fox and the Master Planner were about to write history in the sand. The battlefield of El Alamein was not simply a blank canvas of sand. It was a landscape of extremes that challenged every soldier and every machine. By day, the desert sun blazed with ferocity, turning metal too hot to touch and forcing men to fight with sweat streaming into their eyes. By night, the temperature plummeted, the chill biting through thin uniforms and leaving soldiers shivering in their foxholes. Sandstorms swept across the plain without warning, reducing visibility to nothing, coating rifles and tank engines in choking grit. Beneath the shifting dunes lay hard pan and rock, terrain that could break treads and twist ankles. Dust hung constantly in the air, stirred up by the endless movement of vehicles, making every breath a struggle. For the soldier, the desert was an adversary as much as the enemy army. Heat stroke, dehydration, and exhaustion claimed as many casualties as bullets. Supplies of water were rationed, and every drop carried to the front became as valuable as fuel or ammunition. In this harsh arena, geography was not a backdrop, it was destiny. The geography of El Alamein was unique in North Africa. for here the endless openness of the desert narrowed into a confined corridor. To the north lay the Mediterranean Sea, a natural barrier that prevented large-scale maneuvering. To the south stretched the Kottara Depression, a vast expanse of salt marsh and quicksand-like ground impassable to vehicles. Between these two features ran a strip of desert, barely 40 miles wide, the only route for advancing armies. Unlike the wide flanking movements Rommel had used so successfully in Libya, here he was trapped in a choke point. The Kottara Depression acted like a wall of waterless bog, its treacherous surface impossible for tanks and trucks. The British understood this geography and anchored their defences on the Mediterranean coast and the depression, sealing the corridor like a gate. It was one of the few places in the desert where mobility could be constrained. Geography created a battlefield where defence could finally stand against manoeuvre. El Alamein became a natural fortress, shaped by sea and sand. The British fortified their line with care, knowing that the desert alone would not halt Rommel's Afrika Korps. Along the northern sector, they built strong points and minefields that stretched inland, interlocking with artillery emplacements. Farther south, infantry positions were dug into ridges and depressions, giving cover against Axis tanks. Engineers worked tirelessly to create obstacles, planting thousands of mines in vast belts later nicknamed the Devil's Gardens. These minefields were more than simple defences. They forced enemy armour into narrow channels where artillery and anti-tank guns could focus their fire. The positions were reinforced with barbed wire trenches and dug-in tanks converted into fixed guns. Supply dumps were hidden in wadis and behind ridges, shielded from aerial observation. Every ridge, every dune, every scrap of cover was used to its maximum advantage. The line was not continuous, but it was deep and layered, designed to absorb and then break an assault. Geography was weaponized, transformed into a fortress of sand and steel. Key to the battlefield was the Rue Vizat Ridge, a low rise running east to west across the desert. Though modest in height, it dominated the surrounding plain, offering observation points for artillery and commanders. Whoever held the ridge could control movement across the battlefield, directing fire and spotting enemy concentrations. South of Rue Vizat lay Mitiria Ridge, another key feature that shaped the fighting. To soldiers on the ground, these ridges seemed unimpressive, but in the flat desert landscape, they were mountains of tactical importance. From their crests, entire divisions could be seen moving, dust trails betraying their positions. Control of the ridges meant control of visibility, and visibility was life in desert warfare. British and Axis forces alike understood this, and battles for these ridges became some of the fiercest of the campaign. Geography here was subtle yet decisive, small rises of land shaping the outcome of entire offensives. The ridges of El Alamein became landmarks of blood and fire. In the southern sector, the desert was more open, but the Kottara Depression loomed as a constant barrier. This massive natural feature stretched for hundreds of miles, its floor lying far below sea level. The ground was treacherous, composed of salt pans, soft sands, and marshy patches that swallowed vehicles whole. Tanks attempting to cross would become mired, and trucks sank axle deep, unable to move. Aircraft reconnaissance revealed the danger clearly, and even Rommel admitted the depression was impassable. This meant his forces could not outflank the British from the south, a tactic that had often been his greatest strength. Instead, he was forced to attack directly into the fortified corridor. The British, relieved of the fear of southern encirclement, concentrated their defences where they mattered most. The Kottara Depression, barren and lifeless, became an invisible ally to the Eighth Army. It transformed the desert from an open sea into a narrow battlefield. Nature itself closed Rommel's options. The desert's flatness and openness also made concealment difficult, magnifying the importance of camouflage and deception. Armies resorted to elaborate ruses, disguising tanks as trucks with canvas covers or building dummy vehicles to mislead reconnaissance. Supply dumps were buried under nets, and entire divisions could appear larger or smaller than they were through careful arrangement of equipment. At night, movement was easier, but headlights were forbidden, and vehicles crept forward guided only by compasses and starlight. Minefields were marked with subtle signs known only to the defenders, confusing attackers who blundered into them. The terrain gave no mercy to the careless, and a single navigational error could doom entire units. Geography demanded discipline and ingenuity, shaping not just tactics, but the very survival of armies. To the casual eye, the desert was empty, but to soldiers it was filled with hidden dangers and invisible lines of death. Geography was both a shield and a trap. At El Alamein, every grain of sand mattered. For the soldiers, geography shaped their daily existence in ways both obvious and insidious. Trenches had to be dug into hard, rocky ground, often with picks and explosives rather than shovels. Water was rationed so strictly that men were allowed only a few pints per day, forcing them to choose between drinking, cooking, or washing. Sand clogged weapons, requiring constant cleaning to keep rifles and machine guns functioning. Tanks overheated, their engines strained by dust and heat, while their crews endured suffocating conditions inside metal hulls. Artillery pieces sank into soft sand when fired repeatedly, requiring platforms of stone or timber to stabilize them. Flies swarmed over everything, drawn by the heat and the refuse of war, tormenting soldiers day and night. Boots wore out quickly on the abrasive ground, and wounds became infected in the harsh conditions. Geography was not just a backdrop, it was a daily enemy, wearing down men and machines alike. Survival was as much about enduring the land as about fighting the Axis. Thus, the battlefield of El Alamein was forged by nature as much as by man. The sea to the north and the Qattara Depression to the south created a bottleneck where armies were forced into direct confrontation. Ridges, minefields, and escarpments gave defenders an edge they had long lacked in the open desert. The climate itself punished mistakes, exhausting men, and crippling machines before a shot was fired. Geography stripped away illusions of invincibility, demanding respect from even the most seasoned commanders. Rommel, master of maneuver, found his options narrowed to brutal frontal assaults. Montgomery, master of preparation, found a stage perfectly suited to his doctrine of careful build-up and deliberate strike. At El Alamein, geography became the equalizer, favoring defense over daring. The battle ahead would be shaped not only by commanders and armies, but by the land itself. In the desert, the ground is never neutral. It chooses who will endure and who will fall. After his stunning victories at Gazala and the capture of Tobruk, Erwin Rommel stood at the pinnacle of his career. His reputation as the Desert Fox cemented in the minds of both Axis and Allied commanders. For a brief moment in June 1942, the road to Alexandria seemed open. The British Eighth Army reeling in retreat and morale collapsing. Rommel envisioned a lightning thrust through Egypt, a victory that would bring him to the banks of the Nile and perhaps even to the oil-rich Middle East. Such a triumph would not only cripple the British Empire, but also secure resources vital for Hitler's war machine. Rommel's instinct was always to press the advantage, to turn retreat into rout before the enemy could recover. Yet his ambitions clashed with a reality that had haunted him since his first arrival in North Africa. Supplies every mile eastward stretched his logistical lines thinner, leaving fuel, ammunition, and food increasingly vulnerable. The Mediterranean, patrolled by British ships and submarines, strangled Axis convoys before they could reach Libya. Even in triumph, Rommel knew he was racing against time and scarcity. Rommel's supply problem was the Achilles heel of his otherwise brilliant campaigns. Unlike the British, who enjoyed relatively short supply lines through the Suez Canal and Middle Eastern ports, Rommel's lifeline stretched across the Mediterranean from Italy. Convoys carrying fuel and ammunition had to sail from ports like Naples or Taranto across waters dominated by the Royal Navy and threatened constantly by Allied aircraft. Those that survived still had to unload in Libyan harbors like Tripoli, Benghazi, or Tobruk before their cargo was hauled hundreds of miles over desert tracks to the front lines. Every gallon of fuel consumed by the trucks reduced the supply available to the tanks at the tip of the spear. By the summer of 1942, Rommel's army was advancing faster than his supplies could follow. His panzers often ran low on fuel, forcing pauses at critical moments. The farther he drove into Egypt, the more precarious his situation became. Rommel was a commander of genius, but even genius could not conjure petrol from sand. Despite these constraints, Rommel's drive toward Alexandria and the Nile was relentless. He believed that speed could solve what supplies could not, that by smashing the British before they recovered, he could seize their stockpiles and ports. His plan was not just military, but symbolic. The capture of Egypt would strike a mortal blow to British prestige and cut the empire in two. Cairo, with its administrative hub and communications networks, was within reach. Alexandria, the great Mediterranean port, was a prize that would resupply his army with captured fuel and ammunition. Beyond lay the Suez Canal, the artery through which Britain sustained its empire. Rommel dreamed of a grand link with German forces pushing south through the Caucasus, creating an unbroken chain of Axis control from the Black Sea to the Nile. It was a vision of empire, daring and audacious, in line with Hitler's ambitions for global conquest. Yet each mile eastward made that dream more fragile. Geography and logistics were conspiring against him, even as victory seemed near. German-Italian coordination in North Africa was another constant challenge for Rommel's vision. His Afrika Korps, though formidable, was only one part of Panzerarmee Africa, which included numerous Italian divisions. These units, ranging from armored to infantry, often lacked the training, equipment, and mobility of their German counterparts. Rommel, pragmatic and impatient, frequently dismissed their abilities, yet he relied on them to hold long stretches of the front. Italian tanks, outdated and lightly armored, were no match for British Grants or Shermans, forcing Rommel to use his precious panzers in roles better suited for allies. Supply disparities further strained relations, as German units were prioritized for fuel and ammunition while Italians were left short. Yet despite these weaknesses, Italian troops fought and died in the desert, often with bravery, though seldom with the same effectiveness. Rommel's army was therefore a coalition bound together by necessity rather than harmony. Coordination required diplomacy as well as command, and Rommel's brusque style often created friction. Ambition demanded unity, but unity was always fragile. Berlin and Rome, too, imposed their own complications on Rommel's strategic vision. Hitler admired Rommel's daring, but he was preoccupied with the titanic struggle on the Eastern Front, where Stalingrad and the Caucasus consumed Germany's resources. Mussolini, eager for glory, pressed Rommel to seize Alexandria quickly, dreaming of parades in Cairo that would restore Italy's prestige. Yet neither dictator fully understood the reality of North African logistics, the way supplies evaporated in the desert before they reached the front. Rommel's requests for more shipping tonnage, more fuel, and more reinforcements often went unanswered or were delivered too late. He was a commander praised in propaganda, but under-supported in practice. His victories had raised expectations he could not meet with the resources provided. The Axis grand strategy envisioned Egypt as the gateway to the Middle East, but the means to achieve it were insufficient. Rommel's vision stretched beyond the capacity of his army. Ambition outpaced reality, and reality was merciless. Still, Rommel pressed forward with remarkable energy, determined to maintain momentum. His philosophy was simple: seize the initiative and never allow the enemy to recover. He believed that the British, shaken by Tobruk's fall, were on the verge of collapse, and that one more blow might topple them entirely. His panzers advanced eastward across Egypt, covering distances that astonished his adversaries. Behind them, supply trucks strained, convoys struggled, and mechanics worked frantically to keep vehicles running in the harsh conditions. Fuel shortages forced Rommel to gamble, leaving some units immobile, while others spearheaded the advance. Each decision carried enormous risk, but Rommel trusted in speed and improvisation. His men, hardened by months in the desert, followed him with unwavering faith. To them the desert fox always found a way, and his presence on the battlefield seemed to bend fate. Yet fate itself was growing impatient. The sands of Egypt were not as forgiving as those of Libya. British resistance stiffened as Rommel approached El Alamein, where geography and reinforcements favored defense. For the first time, Rommel faced a position that could not be bypassed, where his maneuver warfare was constrained to frontal assaults. His supply lines, stretched nearly to breaking, were harassed daily by Allied aircraft striking at convoys and depots. His fuel situation grew desperate, forcing rationing so strict that some tanks received only enough fuel for a few hours of combat. Ammunition stocks dwindled, leaving artillery unable to match British barrages. Rommel's vision of sweeping triumph was narrowing into the grim reality of attrition. The British, under new leadership, were rebuilding strength while Rommel's army grew weaker with every advance. Yet even then his instincts drove him to attack, to test the line, to force the issue. The desert fox refused to admit that geography and supply had cornered him. His ambition remained undimmed, even as his strength waned. Rommel's strategic vision was both his genius and his undoing. He saw opportunities where others saw only obstacles, daring to imagine an Axis empire stretching across the sands to the Nile. His drive inspired his troops and terrified his enemies, creating momentum that carried him from Libya to the gates of Egypt. Yet his brilliance as a battlefield commander could not overcome the fundamental truth of logistics. No army can outrun its supplies. Coordination with Italian allies remained strained, support from Berlin and Rome inconsistent, and the geography of El Alamein unyielding. His vision of conquest was dazzling, but it was also fragile, dependent on luck, improvisation, and captured supplies. As he pressed toward Alexandria, Rommel gambled everything on speed, hoping to win before reality caught up. In the desert, however, reality always arrived. The sands of Egypt were about to test ambition against endurance. Rommel's vision had carried him far, but not far enough. When Bernard Montgomery assumed command of the British 8th Army in August 1942, he inherited a force battered by defeats and drained by months of retreat. The memory of Tobruk's fall still haunted the ranks, and morale had been eroded by constant withdrawals before Rommel's relentless advance. Soldiers were weary, equipment was worn down, and confidence in leadership was at a low ebb. Montgomery's arrival marked a decisive break with the past, for he was determined to transform the 8th Army into a disciplined, cohesive, and offensive-minded force. He immediately projected confidence, declaring to his men that retreat was finished and that they would fight where they stood, This firm stance was both symbolic and practical, restoring belief in the possibility of victory. Montgomery understood that morale was as important as tanks or artillery, and he made himself a visible presence among his troops. He toured the lines, spoke directly to soldiers, and instilled a new spirit of determination. The transformation began not with weapons, but with words. Confidence was the foundation upon which reform would be built. Montgomery's first priority was organization, for the 8th Army had been a patchwork of units from across the Commonwealth, often lacking coordination. He streamlined command structures, ensuring that orders were clear, concise, and executable at every level. Gone were the days of vague directives and fragmented counterattacks. Under Montgomery, every soldier would know his role in the larger battle. He emphasized the importance of training and rehearsals, drilling units relentlessly to ensure they could execute complex maneuvers with precision. His staff officers were instructed to plan meticulously, leaving nothing to chance. Logistics, communications, and intelligence were all tightened, transforming a previously reactive army into one that could act with deliberate purpose. Montgomery believed that discipline was not about rigidity, but about clarity, ensuring that chaos would not rule the battlefield again. He replaced confusion with structure, hesitation with resolve. In doing so, he gave the 8th Army the foundation of a professional, unified force. Organization became a weapon in itself. Morale was not simply restored through speeches, it was enforced by discipline. Montgomery insisted on standards in dress, bearing, and behavior, believing that an army that looked confident would become confident. Soldiers were ordered to shave daily, even in the desert, and to maintain proper uniforms despite the harsh climate. These details, small to outsiders, had a profound psychological effect, fostering pride and cohesion. He cracked down on defeatism, making it clear that talk of retreat or surrender would not be tolerated. Montgomery believed that confidence could be cultivated, that the habits of victory preceded victory itself. His insistence on discipline extended to officers, who were expected to lead by example and maintain close control of their units. The army began to carry itself differently, no longer as a beaten force, but as one preparing to strike. Confidence spread through the ranks like a contagion, replacing despair with determination. The 8th Army was being rebuilt from the inside out. Morale became a weapon as sharp as any bayonet. Montgomery also reshaped the army's tactics, discarding ad hoc maneuvers in favor of deliberate, overwhelming blows. He rejected the piecemeal counterattacks that had bled the army at Gazala, insisting instead that all operations be fully resourced and coordinated. Artillery would play a central role, used not just to support but to dominate, pulverizing enemy defenses before infantry and tanks advanced. Armor would no longer be thrown in haphazardly, but concentrated at decisive points, massed to overwhelm rather than dispersed to react. Infantry, tanks, artillery, and air power would work together in carefully orchestrated assaults. This emphasis on combined arms reflected Montgomery's belief in preparation over improvisation. He told his men that they would not fight until they were ready, and when they struck, it would be with irresistible strength. His philosophy was simple: win the battle before it begins through planning and concentration of force. In the desert, where Rommel had thrived on chaos, Montgomery imposed order. His tactics mirrored his character, methodical, deliberate, and unrelenting. Preparation for the decisive battle at El Alamein became an obsession for Montgomery. He oversaw the construction of supply dumps, ensuring that fuel, ammunition, and food were stockpiled in vast quantities close to the front. Engineers laid pipelines for water, trucks ferried supplies night and day, and depots were camouflaged against Axis air reconnaissance. Montgomery knew that logistics, not heroics, would decide the outcome. His staff calculated the precise amounts of artillery shells, fuel and spare parts needed for a sustained offensive, leaving nothing to chance. The British advantage in shipping and supply, bolstered by American Lend-Lease support, was fully exploited under his careful management. Every detail was rehearsed, from clearing minefields to coordinating air support. The Eighth Army was being prepared not just to fight but to endure, to maintain pressure until Rommel's army broke. Montgomery's genius lay in his ability to transform material strength into psychological confidence. Preparation itself became a form of strategy, turning the promise of resources into the certainty of victory. Montgomery's leadership also extended to the air war, where he insisted on close coordination between the Desert Air Force and ground forces. He understood that air superiority was vital to protecting supply lines, harassing enemy logistics, and supporting ground offensives. Under his command, the RAF shifted to a doctrine of constant pressure, ensuring that Rommel's supply convoys and frontline units were never free from attack. Pilots were integrated into the planning of ground operations, ensuring that infantry and tanks could count on air cover during assaults. This coordination denied Rommel the freedom of movement he had once enjoyed. Montgomery emphasized that no part of the war could be fought in isolation. Air, land, and logistics were to function as a single organism. His insistence on joint operations reflected a broader philosophy. Victory was not about individual brilliance but collective effort. In this way, he neutralized Rommel's advantage in improvisation by binding his own army into a coherent whole. The skies, like the desert floor, became part of Montgomery's plan. Air power was folded into the architecture of victory. What distinguished Montgomery most was his psychological understanding of battle. He knew that soldiers fought not only with weapons but with belief, and he made every effort to ensure his men believed in success. He banned talk of defeat, emphasizing instead that they would strike Rommel and destroy him. His confidence, at times bordering on arrogance, spread through the ranks, giving soldiers a sense of inevitability. Unlike Rommel, who thrived on daring, Montgomery thrived on certainty, and he communicated that certainty relentlessly. He addressed entire units, reminding them of their role in history and the importance of their mission. He spoke in clear, direct language, never hiding the challenges, but always framing them as surmountable. Soldiers began to see themselves not as victims of defeat, but as instruments of victory. This transformation in mindset was perhaps Montgomery's greatest reform. He turned despair into determination, uncertainty into assurance. Psychology became strategy, and belief became a weapon. By the time the decisive battle approached, the Eighth Army was no longer the battered force that had retreated from Tobruk. It had been reorganized, disciplined, and infused with confidence. Its logistics secured and its tactics sharpened. Montgomery had taken a broken army and reshaped it into a force capable of standing against Rommel's Afrika Korps. His reforms were not dramatic flourishes, but steady, deliberate changes that accumulated into transformation. Every soldier now knew his place in the larger scheme, every unit rehearsed its role, and every supply depot brimmed with reserves. The contrast with Rommel's overstretched and undersupplied army could not have been sharper. Montgomery had prepared not only for a battle, but for a campaign of annihilation. His army was now ready to absorb Rommel's blows and to deliver a crushing counterstrike. The stage was set for El Alamein to become the turning point of the Desert War. Preparation had forged the path to victory, and Montgomery was ready to walk it. By July 1942, Rommel's Afrika Korps had driven deep into Egypt. The fall of Tobruk, fueling an advance that seemed unstoppable. His troops had covered hundreds of miles, chasing the retreating Eighth Army toward Alexandria and the Nile. Cairo trembled, civilians prepared for evacuation, and British headquarters burned sensitive documents in case the Germans entered the city. Churchill himself feared disaster, describing the situation as the gravest since the dark days of 1940. Yet geography and desperation combined to offer one last chance to stop Rommel. At a narrow strip of desert between the Mediterranean Sea and the Qattara Depression lay a railway halt called El Alamein. Here the terrain closed into a bottleneck, blocking Rommel's ability to outflank the British. It was a natural fortress, the first defensible position since the retreat began. General Auchinleck, commanding the Eighth Army, ordered his men to dig in and hold at all costs. The first Battle of El Alamein was about to begin, and with it the fate of Egypt hung in the balance. Rommel entered the battle with momentum, but also with growing weaknesses. His supply lines stretched precariously from Libya, and fuel shortages slowed his armored spearheads. His men were exhausted from weeks of fighting and long desert marches under the blazing sun. Yet Rommel was unwilling to stop, believing that speed could still deliver victory before the British reorganized. He launched attacks along the Alamein line, seeking a breakthrough that would carry him to Alexandria. The Italian divisions under his command, though brave, were under-equipped, their armor no match for British tanks. German panzers bore the brunt of the offensive, supported by artillery and the Luftwaffe. Initial clashes saw fierce fighting around Rouvezat Ridge and the northern approaches. Rommel pressed hard, but the British defences held stubbornly. The momentum that had carried him so far was beginning to stall in the sands of Alamein. The British defensive stand was both desperate and determined. Auchinleck personally took control of the battle, bypassing his subordinate, General Ritchie, whose leadership had faltered. He reorganized the Eighth Army into coherent formations, placing emphasis on holding strong points and coordinating artillery. Artillery in particular became the backbone of the defense, with batteries pounding advancing Axis units and slowing their momentum. Infantry dug into ridges and escarpments, turning natural features into fortified bastions. Australian, New Zealand, Indian and South African troops fought side by side with British regiments, embodying the multinational character of the Eighth Army. Their task was simple but brutal: hold the line no matter the cost. The heat was oppressive, the dust choking, and casualties mounted on both sides. Yet the British resolve stiffened, driven by the knowledge that retreat meant the loss of Egypt itself. El Alamein became not just a position but a symbol of defiance. Clashes erupted across the battlefield, with both sides contesting key ridges that offered commanding views. Rouvezat Ridge, in particular, became the scene of repeated assaults and counterattacks. Axis tanks charged forward, only to be met by concentrated British artillery and anti-tank fire. The desert was littered with burning vehicles, their black smoke rising into the sky as markers of destruction. At night, both sides launched probing attacks, the desert echoing with bursts of gunfire and the explosions of mortars. The Australians in the north repelled German attempts to breach coastal defences, holding stubbornly against repeated assaults. In the south, Indian divisions fought tenaciously to block Axis moves toward the Qattara Depression. Every mile of desert was contested, every ridge defended with fierce determination. Rommel, used to sweeping maneuvers, found himself bogged down in attritional fighting. The first Battle of El Alamein was no longer a chase, it was a standstill. For Rommel, the battle revealed the limits of his army. Fuel shortages became crippling, leaving tanks immobilized and forcing commanders to ration every movement. Ammunition supplies dwindled, making it difficult to sustain offensive pressure. The Luftwaffe, stretched thin by commitments elsewhere, could not provide the air dominance Rommel had once enjoyed. Meanwhile, Allied air forces grew stronger, harassing Axis convoys and striking supply depots. The Italians, courageous but poorly equipped, suffered heavy losses as they struggled to match the British armour and artillery. Even Rommel's famed improvisation could not overcome the brutal arithmetic of logistics. His men fought with courage, but the desert's harsh conditions drained their strength. Attrition favoured the British, who were receiving reinforcements and supplies through the nearby Suez Canal. For the first time in months, Rommel's aura of invincibility began to fade. The desert fox was trapped by the sands he had once mastered. Auchinleck, though lacking Montgomery's charisma, displayed remarkable steadiness during the battle. He resisted calls to counterattack prematurely, instead focusing on exhausting Rommel's strength. His strategy was defensive by necessity, but effective, buying time for reinforcements to arrive and morale to recover. He rotated units when possible, ensuring that exhausted soldiers were replaced before breaking under pressure. Auchinleck also emphasized cooperation among Commonwealth troops, recognizing that their collective spirit was vital to holding the line. Though his leadership would later be overshadowed by Montgomery, it was Auchinleck who prevented disaster in July 1942. His ability to stabilize the situation gave Britain the breathing space it desperately needed. In the darkest days when Cairo feared invasion, Auchinleck's determination held the Axis at bay. The First Battle of El Alamein was his achievement, even if history would give the glory to others. Without his stand, there might never have been a second battle. By late July, the battle had ground into stalemate, with neither side able to deliver a decisive blow. Rommel, depleted and exhausted, realized he could not break through the Alamein defenses. Auchinleck, though victorious in preventing collapse, lacked the reserves to drive the Axis back. The desert was littered with wrecks, the graves of men and machines testifying to the ferocity of the fighting. Both armies dug in, preparing for the next phase of the struggle. For the British, the battle was a moral turning point. They had stopped Rommel's advance cold. For the Axis, it was a sobering moment, a reminder that momentum alone could not guarantee victory. The stalemate, however, favoured the Allies, who could replenish their losses far more quickly. Supplies poured in, new American tanks arrived, and reinforcements strengthened the Eighth Army. The pause at Alamein was not the end, but the prelude to something greater. The sands were waiting for the next storm. The First Battle of El Alamein was more than a tactical stalemate, it was a strategic turning point. For the first time since the campaign began, Rommel had been stopped short of his objective. Egypt, the Suez Canal, and the British Empire's lifeline had been saved, at least for the moment. The Eighth Army had regained its footing, proving to itself and the world that it could withstand the Desert Fox. Though Auchinleck would soon be replaced by Montgomery, his achievement laid the groundwork for ultimate victory. The battle revealed that Rommel was not invincible, and that the desert could favour defence as well as attack. It marked the end of the long retreat and the beginning of a new phase in the Desert War. From the sands of Alamein, a sense of hope began to rise among the Allies. The second greater battle was already taking shape, and it would decide the fate of North Africa. El Alamein had become the line in the sand, and it would hold. The First Battle of El Alamein had bought the Allies something more valuable than victory time. In those precious weeks of stalemate, the British set about transforming the narrow corridor between the Mediterranean and the Qattara Depression into an impregnable fortress. Montgomery, newly arrived to command the Eighth Army, recognized that defense was his greatest ally in the desert's confined geography. He insisted that no further retreats would be tolerated and that every inch of sand would be fortified. Engineers, sappers, and infantry worked day and night, carving defenses into the desert floor. Miles of trenches were dug, barbed wire strung across open ground, and bunkers built into ridges and wadis. These fortifications were not scattered, but interconnected, forming a network of strong points that supported one another. The Alamein line was no longer just a name on a map. It was becoming a reality of steel and stone. Montgomery's vision was clear. The desert would not merely host the battle, it would become the weapon that destroyed Rommel. At the heart of these defenses were the infamous minefields, planted in staggering numbers across the desert approaches. Tens of thousands of mines, both anti-tank and anti-personnel, were laid in vast belts stretching for miles. They were arranged in patterns designed not simply to kill, but to channel enemy forces into killing zones. British engineers worked with relentless precision, burying explosives beneath the sand while enduring heat, exhaustion, and the constant threat of Axis artillery. Each minefield was mapped carefully, marked for friendly passage, but disguised from enemy eyes. The density of mines was such that advancing tanks could not avoid them, and infantry risked annihilation with every step. These deadly gardens of explosives earned a grim nickname among the troops, the Devil's Gardens. They were not natural obstacles but deliberate creations, designed to bleed Rommel's army white before it could even reach British lines. In the desert, where mobility had been Rommel's greatest strength, Montgomery turned the ground itself into a trap. The minefields alone, however, were not enough. Behind them lay layers of wire entanglements, trenches, and fortified boxes that turned the line into a series of defensive bastions. These boxes were heavily defended, strong points manned by infantry, equipped with machine guns, mortars, and anti-tank weapons. Each box was positioned to support its neighbors, creating interlocking fields of fire that made infiltration nearly impossible. Artillery batteries were carefully placed to cover the gaps, ready to pound any breakthrough attempt with overwhelming fire. The British also positioned tanks in dugouts, using them as stationary guns to surprise attacking panzers. Camouflage was perfected, with positions hidden under nets and painted to blend with the desert. The line was not a single wall, but a web, designed to absorb and exhaust an attacker. Montgomery understood that Rommel's brilliance lay in movement, so he created defenses that would grind movement to a halt. The Alamein line was no longer fragile, it was formidable. The northern sector of the line, anchored on the Mediterranean coast, was particularly strong. Here the Australians and New Zealanders held key positions, their trenches reinforced with concrete bunkers, and their artillery zeroed in on the coastal approaches. The coastline itself offered natural barriers, limiting Rommel's options for flanking maneuvers. Inland, the rouvos at Ridge and Materia Ridge were fortified with mine belts and strongpoints, turning them into bastions of defense. These ridges, modest in height, provided commanding views across the desert, allowing artillery observers to direct devastating fire. To the south, near the edge of the Katra Depression, Indian and South African divisions built defensive zones that connected seamlessly with the natural barrier. The result was a line that stretched from sea to depression, unbroken and unyielding. Montgomery's engineers ensured that no gap remained unguarded, no approach left unmined. In this narrow corridor, the 8th Army transformed terrain into fortress. The desert itself had become a wall of steel. Montgomery's strategy for the Alamein line was not merely to defend but to set the conditions for a counterattack. He believed that Rommel, desperate and stretched thin, would eventually launch assaults against the fortified positions. These assaults would bleed the Afrikaab, draining its limited supplies of men, tanks, and fuel. The minefields would slow them, the wire would trap them, and the artillery would destroy them. Then, when Rommel was weakened and exhausted, Montgomery would strike back with overwhelming force. His plan was not reckless but deliberate, a war of attrition carefully calculated. Every defensive measure was also an offensive preparation, setting the stage for the hammer blow to come. Unlike Rommel, who sought immediate breakthroughs, Montgomery was content to wait until conditions were entirely in his favor. The Alamein line was both shield and sword, holding the enemy at bay while sharpening the weapon for victory. Patience was the essence of Montgomery's trap. The Devil's Gardens became the most feared element of the line, infamous for their scale and lethality. Soldiers tasked with planting the mines often worked under constant threat of enemy shelling, sweating in the sun as they buried explosives with meticulous care. Each mine had to be checked, armed and concealed, a dangerous and exhausting task that demanded nerves of steel. By the autumn of 1942, estimates suggest that over 500,000 mines had been laid, covering the approaches in deadly belts. These fields were so extensive that advancing troops often believed the entire desert had been transformed into one vast explosive trap. Clearing them would require sappers under fire, moving slowly and carefully while under the gaze of British artillery. Rommel's forces knew that every attack would bleed precious time and fuel in these killing zones. The Devil's Gardens were not just obstacles, they were psychological weapons instilling fear before the battle even began. Montgomery had turned engineering into a form of warfare. As the defenses grew stronger, so too did the Eighth Army's confidence. Soldiers who had once doubted their ability to resist Rommel now felt secure behind mine belts and artillery lines. Montgomery encouraged this confidence, reminding his men that the line was not only impregnable, but part of a greater plan to destroy the Afrika Korps. Training continued relentlessly, with units rehearsing movements, learning to coordinate with artillery and air support, and practicing mine-clearing drills. The army that had been shattered at Gazala was now disciplined, prepared, and brimming with supplies. The fortifications were more than just physical defenses. They were a psychological transformation, convincing soldiers that they held the advantage. Every trench dug, every wire strung, every mine planted added to the sense of inevitability. Rommel would come, Montgomery promised, and when he did, he would break against the line. The Alamein defenses gave the Eighth Army something it had lacked for months: confidence. The desert no longer belonged to Rommel alone. By the time the Second Battle of El Alamein approached, the Alamein line stood as one of the most formidable defensive systems of the war. The sea to the north and the Qattara Depression to the south sealed the battlefield, while mines, wire, ridges, and strongpoints created a fortress in the sand. Montgomery's engineers had turned geography into a weapon, constructing the Devil's Gardens to channel and destroy Rommel's attacks. The defenses were not passive, but part of an elaborate plan to trap and annihilate the Afrika Korps. For Rommel, the line represented a barrier he could not outflank, a challenge that demanded costly frontal assaults. For Montgomery, it was the foundation of his strategy, the anvil upon which he would hammer his enemy. The Alamein line was not only a defensive bulwark, it was the stage for one of the decisive battles of World War II. In the sands of Egypt, engineering and strategy had fused into a single lethal design. The trap was ready. The battle was coming. Behind every battlefield victory lies an army of invisible workers, planners, and suppliers, and at El Alamein, in this was truer than ever. Montgomery's great offensive could not begin until the Eighth Army was transformed from a fragile defense into an unstoppable storm. This transformation was not measured in speeches or morale alone, but in tonnage, fuel barrels, crates of ammunition, convoys of tanks, and thousands of trucks rolling eastward. The British command recognized that to break Rommel, they needed not only courage, but overwhelming material superiority. Ports along the Suez Canal worked day and night, unloading ships filled with supplies sent from Britain, India, and America. Railways carried these goods west across Egypt, their tracks groaning under the weight of war. Engineers built depots in the desert, camouflaging them under nets and dugouts to protect against Luftwaffe raids. Every gallon of fuel, every round of artillery, every ration tin was counted and accounted for. Victory would be forged not only with bullets, but with barrels and boxes. The gathering storm was logistical as much as military. Reinforcements poured in from across the British Commonwealth, a reminder that the 8th Army was not merely British but global. Australians, seasoned by earlier desert campaigns, returned to the line, their toughness respected by friend and foe alike. New Zealanders, with their tradition of hard fighting, prepared to contest the ridges once more. Indian divisions, drawn from the vast manpower of the Raj, arrived with infantry battalions trained for desert endurance. South African troops brought their own discipline and tenacity, eager to prove their worth in a decisive battle. From Britain itself came fresh units, bolstering numbers and adding artillery strength. This mixture of nationalities created challenges in coordination, but also a sense of shared purpose, for the fight at El Alamein was understood as a battle for the empire itself. Montgomery harnessed this diversity, ensuring that every formation knew its place in the coming offensive. The 8th Army became a symbol of global resistance, its strength drawn from every corner of the Commonwealth. In its ranks, the world had gathered to stop Rommel. Perhaps the most significant reinforcement, however, came not in men but in machines, shipped across the Atlantic from the United States. American Lend-Lease supplies arrived in growing waves, bringing with them the latest tanks, vehicles, and equipment. The M4 Sherman, with its superior reliability and firepower, became the backbone of British armoured strength. Alongside it came the Grant and Lee tanks, giving the 8th Army a critical edge in armour. Trucks by the thousands carried fuel and ammunition, solving the perennial problem of mobility in the desert. American aircraft joined the fight, strengthening the Desert Air Force and ensuring air superiority over Rommel's dwindling Luftwaffe. Radios, spare parts, and even rations flowed into the supply lines, each item a small piece of the greater whole. This material flood gave Montgomery what Rommel could only dream of, the ability to fight without fear of running dry. The Lend-Lease program was not just aid, it was the lifeline of Allied strategy. At El Alamein, it became the foundation of victory. Fuel was the lifeblood of the Desert War, and Montgomery ensured it would flow in abundance. The 8th Army's panzers, trucks, and artillery all depended on a steady stream of petrol, and vast reserves were built up in the weeks before the battle. Pipelines stretched from the Nile Delta into the desert, carrying fuel directly to forward depots. Trucks hauled thousands of drums, hidden under camouflage nets, or buried in the sand to escape detection. Allied naval dominance in the Mediterranean guaranteed that convoys arrived safely, while Axis shortages grew more desperate by the day. The difference was stark. Rommel's tanks rationed fuel for short operations, while Montgomery's could plan for sustained offensives. Soldiers joked that they were fighting a petrol war, and in many ways they were right. Without fuel, even the mightiest tank was just a steel coffin. Montgomery's obsession with reserves meant that when the time came, the 8th Army would not falter for lack of motion. In the desert, fuel was not just supply, it was survival. Ammunition was another pillar of preparation, and Montgomery ordered it stockpiled in staggering quantities. Artillery was to be the hammer of the coming battle, and its appetite for shells was insatiable. Depots were filled with millions of rounds, stacked in neat rows under camouflage nets, waiting for the order to fire. Mortar bombs, machine gun belts, and rifle cartridges poured in from factories across the empire. Montgomery's plan relied on overwhelming firepower, ensuring that every assault would be preceded and accompanied by devastating barrages. Engineers calculated consumption rates, making certain that no battery would fall silent due to shortage. Trucks and trains ferried these shells forward daily, creating a rhythm of resupply that never ceased. Soldiers visiting the depots were astonished at the sheer scale of preparation, a visible sign that this battle would be different. No longer would the 8th Army fight on thin rations of ammunition. At El Alamein, firepower would rain down like a storm. The desert would tremble under the weight of shells. The build-up was not only about fuel and shells, but about the infrastructure to deliver them. Engineers laid down roads across the sand, carving tracks wide enough to carry convoys of trucks and armored columns. Supply dumps were dug into the desert, their positions carefully dispersed to avoid a single Luftwaffe raid destroying them. Workshops were established close to the front, filled with spare parts and mechanics who could repair tanks and trucks on the spot. Water pipelines were extended, providing life-sustaining supplies to men and machines alike. Medical units were expanded, with hospitals ready to receive the inevitable casualties of the coming offensive. Signals units laid cables for secure communication, ensuring that Montgomery's orders would reach every corner of the battlefield. The 8th Army became a vast machine, its parts carefully aligned and oiled, ready to function under the stress of combat. Logistics was not glamorous, but it was decisive. Without it, Montgomery's strategy would collapse before the first shot was fired. Infrastructure was the skeleton of victory. While supplies flowed in, Montgomery drilled his troops relentlessly to ensure they could use their new strength effectively. Units rehearsed movements across minefields, practiced combined arms tactics, and coordinated with artillery and air support. Training exercises simulated the battle itself, familiarizing soldiers with the terrain and the obstacles they would face. Tank crews learned to work closely with infantry, avoiding the mistakes of previous campaigns where arms had been separated. Artillery officers perfected the timing of barrages, ensuring seamless coverage of advancing troops. Even deception was rehearsed, with dummy tanks and fake supply dumps created to mislead Axis reconnaissance. Montgomery wanted his men to enter battle, not with uncertainty, but with practiced confidence. The drills were exhausting, but they built discipline and trust, turning a patchwork of units into a unified army. Soldiers began to sense that this was not another holding action, but the preparation for something decisive. Training and supply together forged the storm that was about to break. By October 1942, the build-up at El Alamein had reached its crescendo. The 8th Army was no longer the weary force that had retreated from Gazala. It was a rejuvenated, rearmamened and resupplied juggernaut. Behind the front lines stretched miles of depots, fuel dumps, and artillery parks, hidden under camouflage but ready to unleash destruction. The Commonwealth stood united, bolstered by American steel and British determination. Montgomery had created not just an army, but a machine of war, calibrated to strike at the perfect moment. In contrast, Rommel's Afrika Korps was starving for fuel, scraping for ammunition, and watching supplies dwindle with every passing day. The imbalance was clear, one side gathering strength like a storm, the other fading under the sun. The desert, once Rommel's arena of maneuver, was now Montgomery's fortress of preparation. The build-up was complete, the trap was set, and the 8th Army stood ready to deliver the decisive blow. The storm was about to break, and history would be written in fire and steel. Rommel's genius had always been his ability to strike fast, to outmaneuver his enemy and create victories from daring thrusts. Yet by late 1942, even his brilliance could not overcome the brutal arithmetic of supply. The Afrika Korps was an army stretched to its very limits, its lifeline running back across hundreds of miles of desert to the ports of Libya. Every tank that advanced burned fuel faster than it could be replaced. Every shell fired was another added burden on convoys sailing the Mediterranean. The farther Rommel pushed into Egypt, the longer and more fragile his supply lines became. Trucks rattled across endless desert tracks, consuming precious fuel just to deliver a fraction of their loads to the front. Spare parts wore out, engines overheated, and men struggled to maintain vehicles in conditions that devoured machinery as ruthlessly as battle. Supplies that reached Tripoli or Benghazi often failed to reach the fighting troops at all, swallowed by the sheer vastness of the desert. Rommel was a commander fighting not only Montgomery, but geography itself. Logistics, not bullets, became the enemy he could never escape. The foundation of Rommel's problems lay in the Mediterranean, where Allied naval dominance steadily strangled Axis supply routes. Convoys departing from Italian ports faced a gauntlet of British submarines, destroyers, and aircraft based in Malta. The small island, heavily bombed yet unbroken, became a dagger pointed at Axis shipping. From Malta's airfields, squadrons of bombers and fighters pounced on convoys, sinking ships and scattering their escorts. British submarines lurked along shipping lanes, striking at tankers and freighters carrying fuel, ammunition, and food. Even when convoys made it through, they often arrived battered, with only fragments of their cargo intact. Loss rates climbed alarmingly, reducing the flow of supplies to a trickle compared to what Rommel required. The Mediterranean had become an Allied lake, and every drop of petrol that reached the desert was one at enormous risk. Rommel's army starved not from lack of will, but from lack of ships. Naval supremacy turned the desert into a prison of scarcity. Fuel was the most critical shortage, for in the desert every movement depended on it. German panzers, Italian tanks, trucks, and even water pumps relied on fuel to function. Without it, mobility vanished, and Rommel's famed maneuver warfare became impossible. By October 1942, reports from the front revealed tanks with full crews but empty fuel tanks, forced to sit idle as Montgomery prepared his offensive. Entire battalions were immobilized, their vehicles parked uselessly while soldiers dug foxholes and waited. Rommel rationed fuel so tightly that some units received only enough for a few hours of movement, not enough for sustained combat. Ammunition deliveries suffered the same fate, leaving artillery unable to fire at the same intensity as the Allies. Even food became scarce, with rations cut and soldiers forced to subsist on meager supplies. The Desert Fox's army, once sleek and mobile, had become heavy-footed and sluggish. Fuel was no longer just a resource, it was the oxygen of the Afrika Korps, and it was running out. The supply crisis strained not only machines but also men, eroding morale across the Axis ranks. German troops, once confident in their commander's ability to overcome any obstacle, began to feel the weight of shortages in every aspect of daily life. Water was rationed to the bare minimum, leaving men parched under the desert sun. Medical supplies ran thin, forcing doctors to improvise treatments and leaving the wounded to suffer longer. Italian divisions, often given lower priority in supply distribution, endured even harsher conditions. Their outdated tanks and inadequate equipment left them vulnerable, and shortages of fuel and ammunition compounded their disadvantages. Soldiers scavenged for spare parts, cannibalizing wrecked vehicles just to keep a handful running. Hunger, thirst, and exhaustion gnawed at their resilience, creating a sense of despair. The strain was physical and psychological, weakening the very foundation of Rommel's army. Where Montgomery's men gained confidence with every supply convoy, Rommel's troops lost faith with every empty truck. Rommel himself understood the crisis more keenly than anyone, and it haunted his decisions. He pressed Berlin and Rome for more resources, pleading for convoys and reinforcements that rarely arrived in sufficient numbers. Hitler, focused on the titanic struggle at Stalingrad, viewed North Africa as secondary, providing just enough to sustain but never enough to triumph. Mussolini dreamed of parades in Cairo, but could not deliver the shipping capacity or industrial support his ally needed. The Italian navy, battered by losses, struggled to escort convoys, while German submarines were tied down in the Atlantic. Rommel's requests for fuel shipments were sometimes met, but tankers were sunk before they reached Libya. Even when supplies landed, the ports themselves were inadequate, too small to handle the volume required. Rommel's army fought on a starvation diet, its ambitions far larger than its means. For all his battlefield brilliance, he could not conjure supplies from the sea. The desert fox was trapped in a cage built by geography and logistics. The contrast with Montgomery's growing abundance could not have been more stark. While Rommel's fuel was measured in drops, Montgomery stockpiled rivers of petrol. While Rommel rationed shells, Montgomery piled mountains of ammunition for his artillery. Allied convoys arrived in Egypt unmolested, protected by naval supremacy and bolstered by American production. New tanks rolled off ships and into the desert, while Rommel's panzers waited helplessly for spare parts that never came. Soldiers on both sides could see the difference in their daily lives. British rations grew more plentiful, while Axis troops endured hunger and thirst. The imbalance was not only material but psychological, feeding Allied confidence and sapping Axis resolve. The Desert War had become a contest of supply lines as much as strategy. Montgomery commanded a rising tide of strength. Rommel commanded a dwindling reservoir. The outcome of El Alamein was already being shaped long before the guns opened fire. Scarcity was Rommel's true enemy, and it was winning. Rommel attempted to adapt to the crisis, but even his improvisation had limits. He shortened supply lines by capturing Tobruk, but the gains were soon erased by the push deeper into Egypt. He urged greater use of captured Allied supplies, but the British denied him by destroying depots before retreating. He shifted tactics to conserve fuel, reducing the number of large-scale offensives, but this ceded initiative to the Allies. He ordered tanks to be held in reserve, waiting for decisive moments, but without fuel they could not reach the battlefield in time. His army became reactive, forced to endure blows rather than deliver them. Even his famed reconnaissance, once the eyes and ears of his campaigns, was curtailed by lack of fuel for vehicles and aircraft. The crisis robbed Rommel of the very tools that made him dangerous. His brilliance flickered, constrained by shortages he could not control. Adaptation could buy time, but it could not reverse the tide. Logistics had shackled the Desert Fox. By the eve of the Second Battle of El Alamein, the Axis supply crisis had reached its breaking point. Rommel commanded brave and battle-hardened troops, but they were underfed, under-equipped, and undersupplied. His tanks stood idle for lack of petrol, his artillery silent for lack of shells, his soldiers weary from hunger and thirst. In contrast, Montgomery's Eighth Army stood replenished, its depots overflowing with everything an army could require. The imbalance was not hidden, it was visible on the ground, in the dust clouds of British convoys and the empty silence of Axis camps. Rommel's men knew they were going into battle at a disadvantage, yet they trusted their commander to find a way. But no amount of daring could refill empty fuel tanks or restock exhausted depots. The supply crisis had stripped Rommel of his greatest weapon, mobility. At El Alamein, scarcity would face abundance, and in that contrast lay the fate of North Africa. On the night of October 23rd, 1942, the desert erupted with fire as Montgomery launched his long-awaited offensive, Operation Lightfoot. The battle began, not with stealth, but with thunder, as more than 800 British and Commonwealth artillery pieces opened fire in unison. The bombardment lit up the night sky, turning darkness into a blazing panorama of flashes and explosions. For 5 long hours, the guns pounded Axis positions, tearing into trenches, wire, and minefields with unrelenting fury. The noise was deafening, a rolling storm of steel designed to shatter German and Italian defenses and paralyze their response. Soldiers of the 8th Army huddled in their start lines, their faces illuminated by the glow of the bombardment, waiting for the signal to advance. Dust and smoke hung over the battlefield, mingling with the acrid smell of cordite. The desert floor shook under the weight of shells, as if the earth itself were preparing to split open. This was not just an artillery preparation, it was a declaration of intent. The storm had begun, and there would be no turning back. When the guns finally shifted their fire forward, the infantry began their advance. Under the cover of darkness, waves of soldiers moved east to west across the desert, bayonets fixed and nerves steeled. The operation's name, Lightfoot, referred to the infantry's role in clearing the minefields so tanks could follow, stepping lightly where heavy armor could not. Engineers or sappers led the way, probing the sand with bayonets and long rods to find mines buried beneath the surface. They marked safe paths with white tape, often under machine gun fire and mortar bursts. Every step was a gamble, for one missed mine could kill a squad or halt the advance. The infantry moved slowly, crawling at times, as bullets snapped overhead and the ground exploded with sudden violence. Discipline and determination carried them forward, even as casualties mounted. The minefields were not obstacles, they were battlefields unto themselves, fought inch by inch in the night. This was the crucible of Operation Lightfoot. The Axis defenders, though stunned by the artillery, quickly recovered and fought with ferocious determination. German machine gun nests poured fire into the advancing infantry, their tracers slicing the night sky. Mortars dropped shells with deadly precision, scattering formations and forcing men to take cover. The Italians, often underestimated, held their positions with bravery, manning bunkers and firing until overwhelmed. For the British and Commonwealth soldiers, the advance felt like walking into a wall of flame. Communications were strained in the chaos, and units sometimes lost direction in the confusion of darkness and smoke. Yet momentum was everything, and commanders urged their men forward despite mounting losses. Each position taken was paid for in blood, but each gain brought the infantry closer to their objective. The desert rang with shouts, screams, and the crack of rifles in close combat. The night was alive with death, yet the 8th Army pressed on. One of the greatest challenges of the night assault was the minefields, vast belts of explosives laid down by Rommel's engineers. Known as the Devil's Gardens, these fields were designed to halt tanks, but they became killing zones for advancing infantry. Sappers worked feverishly, often lying flat on the ground to feel for mines with their fingers, while shells and bullets rained around them. Casualties among these men were staggering, yet their work was vital, for without cleared paths the offensive would collapse. Progress was agonizingly slow, with safe lanes only a few feet wide, marked by flickering lanterns or strips of tape. Every explosion that claimed a life threatened to halt the advance, but replacements stepped forward to continue the deadly work. Montgomery had calculated that clearing the minefields would take time, and he had prepared his men for the ordeal. Patience and persistence, he believed, would outlast the enemy's fury. The night became a contest of nerve as much as firepower. The devil's gardens were being plucked, one deadly blossom at a time. The infantry battles that raged beyond the minefields were brutal and intimate. Machine gun nests had to be stormed with grenades and bayonets, bunkers cleared room by room in desperate close-quarters combat. Australians and New Zealanders in the northern sector fought ferociously, their determination matched only by the stubborn resistance of the defenders. In the centre, British regiments clawed their way forward, often reduced to hand-to-hand fighting in the smoke and darkness. The Indians and South Africans engaged in equally fierce clashes, their courage tested against fortified positions that refused to yield easily. Casualty lists lengthened by the hour, with stretcher-bearers struggling to keep up. Men fell, not only to bullets and shells, but also to exhaustion, collapsing from the sheer strain of the night advance. Still, the momentum was maintained, for Montgomery had emphasized that no ground was to be relinquished once gained. Inch by inch, the line crept forward, pushing the Axis defenders back. The desert was becoming a graveyard of determination. By dawn on October 24th, the first objectives had been secured, but at a heavy cost. The 8th Army had advanced several miles into the Axis defences, establishing lodgements inside the minefields. Yet the lanes cleared for tanks were still narrow and incomplete, leaving armour unable to exploit the gains fully. Rommel's forces, battered but unbroken, regrouped and prepared counterattacks to contain the breach. Montgomery's plan had not been to achieve a sudden breakthrough, but to wear down the Afrika Korps in grinding attrition. The infantry had achieved their part, opening the door at immense sacrifice. Now the challenge was to widen the lanes and bring the tanks through. The battlefield was a patchwork of cleared paths, smoking wrecks, and bodies lying where they had fallen. The night attack had not broken the Axis, but it had struck them hard. The stage was set for the next phase of the battle. Operation Lightfoot had opened the fight, and there was no turning back. The intensity of the opening assault shocked both sides. For the Axis, the sheer scale of the artillery and infantry advance revealed that this was no probing attack, but a full-scale offensive. For the Allies, the resistance encountered underscored the toughness of the enemy, who refused to collapse under bombardment. Montgomery's strategy of attrition was working, but it demanded sacrifice on a massive scale. Entire battalions had been cut down in the attempt to carve paths through the Devil's Gardens. The survivors pressed on with grim determination, knowing that the success of the entire army depended on their progress. The Luftwaffe tried to strike back at dawn, strafing and bombing the advancing troops, but Allied air superiority limited their effectiveness. The battle was now fully joined, a clash not of maneuver but of will. The desert was filled with the sounds of engines, explosions, and cries of men. Operation Lightfoot had transformed the night into a battlefield of unrelenting chaos. Montgomery, monitoring the battle from his headquarters, remained calm and resolute. He had never promised a swift or easy breakthrough, but rather a battle of grinding attrition that would bleed Rommel's army dry. The night's fighting had cost dearly, but it had also achieved its purpose. The 8th Army was inside the Axis defences, and Rommel was being forced to respond. Every day that followed would see more pressure, more artillery, and more relentless infantry assaults. Montgomery's doctrine of preparation was unfolding exactly as intended. Operation Lightfoot was not about brilliance in a single stroke, but about steady, remorseless progress. The minefields would be cleared, the lanes widened, and the tanks brought through in time. For the soldiers in the line, the price was high. but the promise was victory. The opening moves of El Alamein had begun in fire and blood. The outcome would be decided in the days of fury that followed. As the initial thrust of Operation Lightfoot gave way to protracted combat, the battlefield focus shifted to the ridges that dominated the Alamein corridor. Among these, Materia Ridge, Kidney Ridge, and the nearby Ruvaizat Ridge became the epicenters of fighting. In the flat desert, these modest rises, barely distinguishable to the untrained eye, held immense tactical significance. From their crests, artillery observers could see for miles, directing fire onto advancing formations. Control of the ridges meant control of the battlefield's visibility, and both sides understood their importance. For the Eighth Army, seizing the ridges was essential to widening the breach and preparing the ground for armor. For the Afrika Corps, holding them was the key to blunting the offensive and preventing a decisive breakthrough. The struggle that ensued was characterized by brutal infantry combat, artillery duels, and counterattacks delivered with ferocious intensity. These ridges, once barren strips of sand and stone, became soaked in blood. They were the fulcrums upon which the Battle of El Alamein balanced. Materia Ridge, lying east of the main Axis line, was one of Montgomery's early objectives. British and Australian forces advanced against it in waves, enduring heavy fire from entrenched German and Italian positions. Axis defenders had prepared their bunkers carefully, interlocking machine gun nests and artillery to cover every approach. Mines slowed the attackers, forcing them into narrow lanes that became death traps under mortar fire. The British artillery provided constant support, laying down rolling barrages to suppress enemy strongpoints. Even so, the advance was slow and costly, with casualties mounting in every battalion. Men crawled through the dust, clutching their rifles, while stretcher-bearers risked their lives to carry the wounded back through minefields. The ridge itself was a shallow rise, but to the men climbing it, it felt like a fortress. By dawn, portions of the ridge were in Allied hands, but the victory came at a staggering cost. Materia had been won, but at a price measured in blood. Kidney Ridge, farther north, became the scene of some of the fiercest fighting of the entire battle. The ridge was not a single rise, but a series of undulating dunes and shallow heights, offering natural defensive positions. Here Rommel concentrated some of his best troops, supported by tanks and artillery, determined to hold the line. The Australians and New Zealanders bore the brunt of the assault, advancing under withering fire. At night the desert echoed with the clash of bayonets and the flash of grenades as men fought in close quarters. During the day, German artillery pounded the slopes relentlessly, forcing the attackers to dig in and cling to whatever ground they had gained. Counterattacks came swiftly, with panzers charging to drive the Allies back down the ridge. Time and again, the fighting swayed back and forth, neither side willing to yield. Kidney Ridge became a cauldron of destruction, where survival was measured in minutes and yards. It was the ridge that refused to fall easily. The struggle for the ridges became a test of endurance for both armies. Axis soldiers, though exhausted and undersupplied, fought with remarkable tenacity, often counterattacking immediately after losing ground. Rommel's orders emphasized aggression, demanding that every breach be sealed before it could widen. German infantry and Italian units, side by side, launched countercharges under artillery fire, bayonets fixed and determination etched on their faces. Some of these counterattacks briefly regained positions, only to be driven out again by fresh Allied assaults. The cycle repeated day after day, with the ridges changing hands multiple times. Casualties mounted on both sides, with bodies lying scattered across the slopes, the desert wind blowing sand over the fallen. Montgomery's artillery superiority began to tilt the balance, punishing every Axis counterattack with devastating barrages. The defenders fought with valor, but attrition gnawed at their strength. The ridges became monuments to persistence, where determination clashed with exhaustion. Neither side could afford to lose, but only one could endure. For Montgomery, the struggle for the ridges was all part of the larger plan of attrition. He had never promised quick breakthroughs, and the bitter, grinding combat suited his strategy. Each Axis counterattack consumed fuel, ammunition, and men that Rommel could not replace. Each Allied advance, though costly, was sustained by deep reserves of supply and reinforcements. Artillery fire became the decisive factor, with the 8th Army's guns firing tens of thousands of shells in carefully coordinated barrages. Axis defenders, often with fewer guns and dwindling shells, could not match the volume of fire. Allied aircraft also joined the contest, strafing and bombing counterattack formations as they formed. Slowly, the weight of Allied firepower began to erode the defenders' ability to hold the ridges. Montgomery's patience was paying off, though at the cost of heavy casualties among his infantry. The struggle was not glamorous, but it was effective. The ridges were being ground down into stepping stones for victory. Rommel's counterattacks, once his hallmark, began to falter under the strain of shortages and exhaustion. His panzers, rationed on fuel, could not maneuver with their usual speed and daring. Tank crews waited for orders, only to find they lacked the petrol to execute them. Artillery batteries, short of shells, fired cautiously, unable to maintain sustained barrages. Even the Luftwaffe's attempts to intervene were blunted by Allied air superiority, which harassed Axis positions with relentless bombing. The defenders fought bravely, but their ability to launch effective ripostes diminished with each passing day. Rommel himself, weakened by illness and absence for parts of the battle, could not personally direct every counterstroke. Leadership fell to subordinates who lacked his touch, and coordination suffered. The Afrika Korps was still dangerous, but its claws were being dulled. The ridges bore witness to the slow crumbling of Axis strength. For the soldiers on the ground, the struggle for the ridges was a nightmare of attrition. Heat by day and cold by night compounded the misery of constant fighting. Sand clogged rifles, and water was rationed, leaving men parched as they scrambled up rocky slopes under fire. Trenches dug on the ridges became shallow graves, filled with the wounded and the dead. Medical teams worked frantically under shell fire, dragging casualties back through minefields and across open ground. Exhaustion blurred the days together, with men fighting on instinct more than conscious thought. Survivors remembered the ridges as places of unrelenting terror, where every advance felt like walking into death itself. Yet despite the horror, they pressed on, driven by orders, comradeship, and the knowledge that retreat was no longer an option. The ridges became symbols of endurance, testing human limits as much as military tactics. For many, they were the defining memory of El Alamein. By the end of October, the Allies had secured footholds on Mitiria and Kidney Ridge, though at immense cost. The Axis counterattacks had bled themselves dry, failing to dislodge the 8th Army from its gains. Montgomery's strategy of attrition had succeeded in drawing Rommel into a battle he could not afford to fight. The ridges were scarred, littered with wrecks and the bodies of men who had contested every foot of ground. For the Allies, the gains represented progress, slow but steady, toward breaking the Axis line. For Rommel, they marked the beginning of the end, the loss of positions that could not be easily regained. The struggle for the ridges had not delivered a breakthrough, but it had weakened the defenders irreparably. The 8th Army now stood poised to launch the next phase of the battle, Operation Supercharge. The ridges, won with blood and fire, had set the stage for decisive victory. The desert had chosen endurance over daring, and endurance was winning. As the struggle for the ridges intensified, the focus of the battle shifted to the armored divisions, the steel fists of both armies. Tanks had always been the centerpiece of desert warfare, their mobility and firepower transforming the open sands into an arena of mechanized duels. At El Alamein, however, the nature of tank combat was changing. Gone were the sweeping flanking maneuvers of earlier campaigns. Instead, armor was forced into direct clashes within narrow corridors cleared through minefields. The British brought to the battlefield their new American-made Shermans, alongside older Grants and Crusaders, forming the backbone of their armored might. Facing them were German Panzer III and IV models, battle-hardened but reduced in numbers by attrition and fuel shortages. Italian divisions contributed M13/40 and Semivente self-propelled guns, brave but hopelessly outclassed by Allied armor. The stage was set for armored duels fought under the shadow of artillery and air power. In this phase of El Alamein, steel would grind against steel. The tank battles would decide who commanded the desert's lifeblood, mobility. The Sherman tank, introduced to the desert in 1942, was a revelation for the 8th Army. With its powerful 75 mm gun, reliable mechanics, and superior mobility, it outclassed most German and Italian tanks in service. Unlike earlier British models, the Sherman combined speed, armor, and firepower in a balanced package, giving crews newfound confidence. The Grant, though older, still packed a punch with its side-mounted 75 mm gun, useful for pounding enemy strongpoints. Together, these American machines gave Montgomery's armored brigades an edge they had long lacked. For the first time, British tank crews entered battle knowing they could match and even surpass their German adversaries. The psychological impact was immense, boosting morale across the 8th Army. The desert was no longer a playground for the Afrika Korps alone. Now the Allies had tanks that could fight toe-to-toe with Rommel's panzers. The balance of armored power was shifting in the sands of Egypt. The Germans, though fewer in number, still fought with skill and ferocity. Their Panzer III tanks, once the spearhead of victory, were increasingly outgunned by Shermans and Grants. The Panzer IV, particularly the later versions with long-barreled 75 mm guns, remained dangerous opponents capable of knocking out Allied tanks at range. German crews, experienced and disciplined, used terrain to their advantage, concealing their tanks in hull-down positions behind ridges. They coordinated with anti-tank guns, such as the feared 88 mm, which claimed many Allied vehicles before they could even close the distance. Rommel's doctrine of combined arms was still evident, with tanks, infantry, and artillery working together. Yet shortages of fuel and spare parts limited their mobility and numbers. Every tank lost was irreplaceable, while the Allies could call upon reserves waiting just behind the lines. The Germans still struck hard, but their armored arm was slowly bleeding out. Attrition was the enemy they could not outmaneuver. The Italians, often derided by their enemies, played a significant but costly role in the armored battles. Their M13/40 tanks, with thin armor and underpowered guns, were woefully inadequate against Shermans or even Crusaders. Italian crews nonetheless fought bravely, often charging into hopeless situations to support German counterattacks. The Semivente self-propelled guns, mounting 75 mm weapons, proved more useful, providing mobile fire support that could harass Allied tanks and infantry. Yet Italian armored divisions suffered catastrophic losses whenever they faced concentrated Allied assaults. Many Italian units were decimated, their courage undone by poor equipment and lack of supplies. Their sacrifices bought time for Rommel's Germans, but did little to alter the balance of power. The desert was merciless to outdated machines, and bravery alone could not close the gap. At El Alamein, Italian armor became a symbol of valor squandered by inferiority. Their losses added to the mounting strain on the Axis front. The armored clashes themselves were scenes of chaos and destruction. Dust clouds rose as tank columns maneuvered across the desert floor, engines roaring and treads grinding the sand. Shells screamed across the battlefield, striking with thunderous explosions that sent turrets flying and hulls burning. Inside the tanks, crews worked in suffocating heat, shouting over the roar of engines and the clang of shells striking steel. Communication was often frantic, with commanders struggling to maintain control as units scattered under fire. In many engagements, tanks fought at close range, blasting each other in brutal duels where seconds determined survival. Smoke, fire, and dust obscured vision, reducing the desert to a battlefield of shadows and shapes. Artillery thundered in the background, and aircraft swooped down to strafe columns caught in the open. The desert became a cauldron of steel, where men fought not only the enemy but also heat, exhaustion, and fear. It was industrial war stripped to its brutal essence. Montgomery's use of tanks reflected his deliberate style of warfare. He did not hurl them forward recklessly, as had often been the case earlier in the Desert War. Instead, he coordinated armor with artillery and infantry, using tanks to exploit breaches rather than to create them. Tanks advanced behind rolling barrages, shielded by the thunder of hundreds of guns. Engineers cleared lanes through minefields so armor could move without catastrophic losses. Air cover ensured that German and Italian tanks were harried from above, further weakening their impact. Montgomery's methodical approach denied Rommel the opportunities he once thrived upon. Instead of open maneuver battles, El Alamein became a grinding contest of attrition, where Allied numbers and firepower slowly eroded Axis strength. The tank battles were no longer about daring maneuvers, but about sustained, coordinated blows. This change in tactics was decisive, transforming Allied armor into a disciplined instrument of victory. Rommel attempted to respond with his traditional counterattacks, sending panzers forward in sharp thrust designed to disrupt Allied momentum. Time and again his tanks charged into the fray, trading blows with Shermans and Grants under the blazing sun. But the counterattacks lacked the punch of earlier campaigns. Fuel shortages meant fewer tanks could be committed at once, and artillery support was limited by dwindling ammunition. Each thrust was met by a wall of fire, artillery, anti-tank guns, and swarms of Allied tanks waiting to counter. Losses mounted, and even successful strikes could not be exploited for lack of reserves. The Afrika Korps was still formidable, but its edge had dulled. Rommel's armored arm, once the terror of the desert, was being blunted with every engagement. The counterattacks no longer turned the tide, they merely delayed the inevitable. Attrition, not maneuver, dictated the outcome. By the end of October, the tank battles had drained Rommel's armored divisions of much of their remaining strength. Burned-out hulls littered the desert, silent monuments to the ferocity of the clashes. The Allies, though suffering heavy losses themselves, could replace their tanks with reserves waiting behind the lines. For Rommel, every loss was irreplaceable, another nail in the coffin of the Afrika Korps. The Italians had been shattered, their divisions reduced to remnants, while the Germans fought on with grim determination but dwindling resources. Montgomery's deliberate use of armor had achieved its purpose to wear down Rommel's strength until he could no longer resist. The ridges had been contested, the minefields breached, and the armored duels fought. The balance of power now tilted decisively toward the Allies. The desert steel storm had played out, and the Afrika Korps was staggering under the weight of attrition. The decisive moment was approaching. The armor of El Alamein had paved the way for victory. Above the burning sands of El Alamein, another battle raged, unseen by many soldiers on the ground, yet decisive in shaping the outcome. The desert sky became a battlefield where the RAF Desert Air Force and the Luftwaffe fought for control. Air superiority was not a luxury, it was a necessity, for in the wide open desert, every convoy, tank column and supply line was vulnerable from above. The roar of engines and the scream of diving aircraft punctuated the thunder of artillery, blending into the symphony of total war. By 1942, the RAF had learned its lessons from earlier campaigns, fielding a formidable mix of fighters, bombers and ground attack aircraft. Spitfires and Kitty Hawks hunted the skies, while Hurricanes strafed enemy columns with ruthless efficiency. The Luftwaffe, once dominant, was now stretched thin, with fewer planes and dwindling fuel reserves. Every sortie demanded precious resources, and replacements were slow to arrive. The struggle for the skies was as fierce as that on the ground. Victory at El Alamein would be decided not only in the sand but also in the clouds. The RAF Desert Air Force was a multinational formation, drawing pilots and crews from across the Commonwealth. Australians, South Africans, New Zealanders and British airmen flew side by side, united by the mission to dominate the desert skies. Their aircraft adapted well to the harsh environment, operating from rough airstrips carved out of sand and rock. Maintenance crews worked tirelessly in brutal conditions, battling heat and dust to keep engines running. Aircraft were patched together from salvaged parts, repaired in open airfields under constant threat of attack. Despite these challenges, the RAF had numbers and momentum on its side. By October 1942, it could field hundreds of operational aircraft, far surpassing the Luftwaffe's dwindling presence. The balance had shifted from defensive sorties to aggressive air campaigns. The Desert Air Force was no longer merely supporting the ground battle, it was shaping it. In the skies as on the ground, the Allies now held the initiative. For the Luftwaffe, the situation was grim. Rommel had long relied on German air power to provide reconnaissance, disrupt Allied supply lines, and strike at advancing armor. Yet at El Alamein, his air force was a shadow of its former self. Fuel shortages grounded many aircraft, leaving pilots frustrated and mechanics idle. Losses sustained over Malta and during earlier North African battles had bled the Luftwaffe white. Squadrons that once boasted dozens of aircraft could now field only a handful. Every sortie had to be carefully planned, for each drop of fuel was precious. Airfields were harassed constantly by RAF raids, destroying planes on the ground before they could even take off. The Luftwaffe still had skilled pilots, men who could match or outfight their Allied counterparts, but they were too few to alter the course of the battle. The skies, once a balanced contest, had become an arena of Allied dominance. The Luftwaffe could sting, but it could not sustain. Close air support became one of the most critical roles of the RAF during the battle. Fighter bombers swooped low over Axis trenches, strafing with machine guns and dropping bombs on supply dumps and artillery positions. Kitty Hawks and Hurricanes dove into columns of advancing or retreating Axis vehicles, turning roads into burning wreckage. Pilots flew multiple sorties a day, sometimes returning with bullet holes and sand in their engines, only to be refueled and sent back into the fight. The psychological effect on Axis troops was profound. Every movement risked drawing the attention of circling aircraft. Soldiers spoke of the sky itself becoming their enemy, striking without warning. Allied infantry cheered whenever RAF planes appeared overhead, knowing their own advance was being shielded from counterattack. The Luftwaffe attempted to provide similar support, but fuel shortages and Allied air dominance curtailed their effectiveness. In the Desert War, close air support multiplied the power of every ground assault. The desert floor shook not only from shells, but also from bombs falling from the sky. Beyond the battlefield itself, the RAF focused on interdiction, cutting Rommel's lifelines before they could reach the front. Axis convoys struggled through narrow desert tracks, only to be hunted mercilessly from above. Fuel trucks went up in flames, ammunition trucks exploded into fireballs, and food supplies were scattered across the sand. Air raids struck at supply depots, ports, and rail lines, strangling Rommel's already precarious logistics. This air campaign amplified the effect of Allied naval dominance in the Mediterranean, creating a double chokehold on Axis resources. Even when supplies landed in North Africa, the odds of them reaching the front shrank under relentless air attack. The Afrika Korps began to live from hand to mouth, with convoys decimated and stockpiles shrinking. Air interdiction turned scarcity into desperation, leaving Rommel's forces weakened before the decisive blows on the ground. The battle was being fought not only in trenches and tank duels, but in the skies over convoys. Air power made the desert a battlefield without sanctuary. Air superiority also provided the Allies with a vital reconnaissance advantage. From high above, reconnaissance aircraft photographed Axis positions, mapping trenches, minefields, and troop concentrations. Pilots risked flak and enemy fighters to deliver images that Montgomery and his staff used to refine battle plans. The clarity of these aerial photographs gave the 8th Army a near-complete picture of Rommel's defences. Axis attempts at similar reconnaissance were hampered by Allied fighter patrols, which intercepted and destroyed observation planes before they could gather data. Rommel, once famed for his uncanny battlefield awareness, found himself increasingly blind. His situational picture grew blurred, while Montgomery's became sharper with each passing day. Information, as much as ammunition, became a weapon in the desert. Air superiority meant not only dominance in combat, but also dominance in knowledge. The battle for El Alamein was being won as much with cameras as with guns. For the men on the ground, the presence of aircraft was constant and inescapable. Axis troops dug deeper trenches and camouflaged their vehicles, trying desperately to evade the ever-watchful Allied pilots. Allied soldiers, on the other hand, took comfort in seeing friendly fighters and bombers overhead, their engines a reassuring sound of support. The roar of Spitfires diving on enemy positions became a soundtrack to the battle, blending with artillery barrages and machine gun fire. Pilots became heroes to infantrymen, often remembered in accounts of the battle as angels of protection. Yet for the pilots themselves, the fighting was relentless and exhausting, with little rest between missions. Heat, sand, and mechanical strain pushed both men and machines to their limits. Still, the Desert Air Force maintained its relentless tempo, overwhelming the Luftwaffe's thin presence. To soldiers on both sides, the desert sky was no longer neutral ground. It had become a weapon wielded decisively by the Allies. By the end of October 1942, Allied air superiority was absolute. The Luftwaffe had been reduced to sporadic sorties, while the Desert Air Force flew hundreds of missions each day. Axis convoys burned under constant attack, their supplies dwindling before they could reach Rommel's army. Allied infantry and armour advanced with the confidence that the skies belonged to them, their every move shielded by aircraft above. Montgomery had insisted that air and ground operations be integrated, and at El Alamein this coordination reached new heights. The RLF's dominance amplified every success of the 8th Army, while the Luftwaffe's decline deepened every Axis setback. The desert sky had been transformed into an extension of the battlefield, where Allied superiority became decisive. El Alamein was not only a triumph of tanks and guns, but also of wings. In the desert, As in Europe, air power proved itself indispensable. The battle for the sands was decided, in no small part by mastery of the skies. By the autumn of 1942, the Desert Fox himself was faltering. Erwin Rommel, whose name had become synonymous with daring maneuvers and desert victories, was no longer the indefatigable commander of legend. Years of relentless campaigning, combined with the strain of leading a starving army, had taken their toll. He suffered from stomach ailments, exhaustion and depression, conditions worsened by the harsh desert climate and constant stress. Rommel's energy, once his greatest weapon, now ebbed away, leaving him physically weakened and mentally drained. He could not drive the battlefield with his usual vigor, nor could he personally supervise every counterattack. Reports describe him as gaunt, his once sharp eyes dulled by fatigue. Medical advisors urged him to rest, fearing collapse if he continued. Even the Desert Fox, who had defied odds time and again, could not fight illness and logistics at the same time. At the very moment the Afrika Korps needed his presence most, their commander was forced to step aside. Rommel's departure from the battlefield created a vacuum that was immediately felt within the Axis ranks. On September 22, 1942, under doctor's orders, he returned to Germany to recuperate. His exit was not only physical but symbolic, stripping the Afrika Korps of its guiding force. For his soldiers, Rommel was more than a general. He was a source of inspiration, a commander who shared their hardships and led from the front. Without him, morale sagged, and uncertainty crept into the ranks. Soldiers wondered if their sacrifices would still be honored, and officers feared that Berlin and Rome would not provide decisive support. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded the Afrika Korps seemed to dim overnight. Though Rommel promised to return, his absence cast a shadow across the desert battlefield. Leadership in war is more than orders, it is presence, and Rommel's absence left a void that no replacement could truly fill. In Rommel's place, temporary command of the Afrika Korps fell to General Georg Stumme, an officer of experience but not of equal reputation. Stumme had fought in North Africa before, but his style was cautious, lacking Rommel's instinct for bold counterattacks. He inherited not only the battlefield, but also its impossible problems: dwindling fuel, collapsing supply lines, and an army stretched to the breaking point. Stumme's challenge was immense, for he faced Montgomery's gathering storm without Rommel's charisma to rally the troops. The Eighth Army's offensive was imminent, and Stumme knew that the weight of history would soon crash upon his shoulders. He attempted to steady the line, working within the constraints handed to him. Yet his authority was fragile, for many German officers looked to Rommel as the only true leader. Italian commanders, too, doubted whether Stumme could replace the Desert Fox's iron will. Leadership at El Alamein had shifted, but not in the Axis's favor. The crisis of command had begun. Stumme's tenure was tragically short. On October 24th, the second day of Montgomery's great offensive, Stumme collapsed and died, reportedly of a heart attack, while moving between frontline positions. The stress of command in such dire circumstances proved too much for him. His sudden death added chaos to an already desperate situation. German officers scrambled to reassert control, while Axis units fought on amid confusion. For the men in the trenches, news of Stumme's death spread uncertainty and fear. Without clear orders, some units fought independently, while others hesitated, unsure of their role. The fragile cohesion of the Axis defense was shaken at a critical moment. Leadership in wartime must inspire confidence, but Stumme's loss delivered shock instead. The Afrika Korps, already battered, was now leaderless at the height of crisis. Fate had dealt Rommel's army another cruel blow. Into this turmoil stepped General Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma, commander of the armored forces, who assumed temporary overall command. Von Thoma was a capable officer, respected for his professionalism and knowledge of armored warfare. Yet he lacked Rommel's daring spirit and Stumm's familiarity with the desert battlefield. He fought with determination, directing counterattacks where possible, and holding the line with grim resolve. But von Thoma's appointment highlighted the Axis's deeper problem. Leadership had become reactive rather than proactive. With Rommel absent and Stumm dead, there was no single figure to unify strategy and inspire the army. Decisions were made cautiously, often too slowly to counter Montgomery's deliberate but relentless advances. Von Thoma fought bravely, but he was merely holding the fort until Rommel's return. The Axis command structure was functional but fragile, stretched thin by both material shortages and a vacuum of inspiration. Leadership had shifted from boldness to survival. For Montgomery, the Axis command crisis was an unseen but decisive advantage. He had studied Rommel's style and respected his capabilities, but he knew his absence would sap Axis morale. Allied intelligence quickly learned of Rommel's departure and Stummer's death, reinforcing Montgomery's confidence. He pressed his offensive knowing that his enemy was not only short of fuel and ammunition, but also of clear leadership. This contrast between Allied unity and Axis disarray was stark. Montgomery commanded with calm authority, supported by a vast staff and a well-organized army. The Axis, meanwhile, endured uncertainty, their chain of command disrupted and their options narrowing. In war, leadership is itself a form of weaponry. At El Alamein, Montgomery wielded his decisively, while the Axis floundered without its guiding hand. The crisis of command deepened Rommel's already desperate predicament. Rommel's absence also created friction between German and Italian commanders. The Italians, often relegated to secondary roles under Rommel, felt even more marginalized under his replacements. Their divisions, poorly equipped and suffering heavy losses, received little reassurance from Axis command. German officers, preoccupied with their own survival, did little to coordinate effectively with their Italian allies. Miscommunication and mistrust spread, weakening the cohesion of Axis defenses. Where Rommel had commanded respect across national lines, his successors could not replicate the bond. The fragile alliance frayed under the pressure of Montgomery's offensive. Italians accused Germans of hoarding supplies, while Germans doubted Italian reliability in counterattacks. Unity, already strained, began to collapse just when it was needed most. The crisis of command was not just about leadership, but about alliance. And at El Alamein, the Axis alliance was unraveling. When Rommel finally returned in late October, the damage had already been done. He found an army reeling from Montgomery's relentless offensive, its supplies exhausted and its leadership shaken by Stumm's sudden death. Von Thoma had done his best, but the momentum had shifted irreversibly. Rommel resumed command, but he could not restore what had been lost during his absence. The Afrika Korps was weakened, disheartened, and fighting defensively under impossible conditions. Leadership, once the greatest asset of the Axis in North Africa, had become a liability. Rommel's illness had exposed the fragility of the entire command structure. The Desert Fox returned to find his army cornered, its fate already being sealed. At El Alamein, the crisis of command proved as fatal as shortages of fuel and ammunition. The battlefield had punished not only weakness of supply, but weakness of leadership. The turning point was approaching, and the Axis was stumbling into defeat. By the end of October 1942, Montgomery knew the time had come to deliver the decisive strike. Operation Lightfoot had achieved its purpose, wearing down the Axis and securing lodgements in their defenses. Yet the ridges and minefields had exacted a heavy price, and progress was slow. Montgomery had no illusions that Rommel would collapse without a final hammer blow. Thus he devised Operation Supercharge, a concentrated assault aimed at the northern sector, where the terrain allowed armor to be unleashed once the defenses were breached. This was not a probing attack or a diversion, but the decisive thrust of the battle. Every resource of the 8th Army would be concentrated here: artillery, infantry, tanks, and air support, all synchronized for maximum impact. Montgomery's plan was simple but brutal: overwhelm the enemy through sheer firepower and numbers. The battlefield had been prepared. Now it was time to break the Axis line. Operation Supercharge was to be the knockout punch. The assault began on the night of November 1st, under the cover of darkness. Artillery thundered once again, hundreds of guns unleashing a massive bombardment across a narrow front north of Kidney Ridge. The ground shook with the intensity of the barrage, shells cascading onto Axis positions with relentless fury. Infantry units, led by the battle-hardened New Zealand Division, moved forward behind the curtain of fire. Sappers worked feverishly to clear new lanes through minefields, risking their lives under fire to open paths wide enough for tanks. The infantry's task was to seize a corridor, secure it, and hold it against inevitable counterattacks. Once established, British armoured brigades would pour through, driving deep into the heart of Rommel's defences. The night sky flickered with muzzle flashes and explosions, casting eerie shadows across the desert. Soldiers advanced with bayonets fixed, nerves steeled by the knowledge that this was the decisive assault. Operation Supercharge had begun with thunder and determination. The New Zealanders bore the brunt of the opening assault, fighting with ferocity through minefields and entrenched Axis strongpoints. Their objective was to open the way for the armoured spearheads, and they advanced relentlessly despite heavy casualties. Machine gun nests were stormed, trenches cleared with grenades, and stubborn bunkers silenced with explosives. Axis defenders fought with grim determination, but the weight of artillery and infantry pressure pushed them back. Casualty reports tell of entire companies reduced to fragments, yet the New Zealanders pressed on, driven by duty and the knowledge that the battle's outcome hinged on their success. To their left and right, British infantry advanced in support, widening the breach and securing the flanks. Smoke, dust, and fire obscured the battlefield, creating confusion but also concealment for the attackers. By dawn, the corridor had been opened, though at a staggering human cost. The sacrifice of the infantry paved the way for the tanks. The first stage of Supercharge had succeeded. With the breach secured, the armoured brigades surged forward into the corridor. Shermans, Grants, and Crusaders roared into action, their engines growling as they advanced through the cleared lanes. This was the decisive moment Montgomery had envisioned, the unleashing of armoured power against a weakened and overextended Axis defence. The tanks rolled forward in waves, their guns firing at targets that emerged from smoke and sand. German anti-tank guns, especially the dreaded 88 mm, struck back with deadly accuracy, knocking out Allied tanks one after another. The battlefield became a hellscape of burning vehicles, black smoke rising into the desert sky. Yet the momentum of the attack could not be stopped. Allied tanks absorbed losses, but continued to push forward, supported by relentless artillery fire. For every tank destroyed, more rolled into the fight, overwhelming the defenders. The armoured thrust was grinding the Axis line into fragments. Operation Supercharge was breaking through. Rommel's forces, battered and exhausted, launched desperate counterattacks to stem the tide. Panzers surged forward, firing as they maneuvered, attempting to disrupt the Allied advance. Italian armoured units joined the fight, their outdated machines bravely charging into hopeless duels with Shermans. The counterattacks were fierce, but lacked the coordination and strength of earlier campaigns. Fuel shortages limited their reach, while Allied artillery and air power pounded them mercilessly. Fighter bombers swooped down, strafing and bombing Axis armor caught in the open. Each counterattack bought only minutes, not hours, and losses mounted rapidly. Rommel's reserves dwindled with each passing hour, his ability to resist eroding in the face of overwhelming Allied strength. His defensive line, once formidable, was unraveling under the pressure. The Afrika Korps was fighting with courage but no longer with hope. Supercharge was tearing the heart out of Axis resistance. The battlefield during Supercharge was a scene of unimaginable chaos. Tank hulls burned fiercely, their flames visible for miles in the desert night. The ground was littered with wreckage, twisted steel, shattered guns, and the bodies of men who had fought to the end. Infantry clung to their gains amid constant shelling, while medics worked frantically to save the wounded under fire. Radio chatter crackled with urgency, commanders struggling to coordinate in the confusion. Dust clouds hung heavy in the air, obscuring vision and choking soldiers as they fought. The thunder of guns, the roar of engines, and the scream of aircraft created a soundscape of total war. For those in the midst of it, the battle felt endless, a blur of violence and survival. Yet through the chaos, the Allied line continued to inch forward. Progress was measured, not in miles but in shattered enemy positions. The breakthrough was costly, but it was happening. By November 2nd, the scale of Axis losses was undeniable. Hundreds of tanks, guns, and vehicles had been destroyed, leaving the Afrika Korps a shadow of its former strength. The Italian divisions suffered catastrophic casualties, their formations shattered beyond repair. German units, though still fighting fiercely, were reduced to fragments, incapable of sustained defense. Montgomery's strategy of attrition had succeeded. Rommel had been bled dry. The Allied armored spearheads pressed deeper, widening the breach, and driving into the open desert beyond. Air power reinforced the assault, hammering retreating convoys and battering any remaining reserves. Rommel himself recognized the futility of continued resistance, admitting in reports that his army faced annihilation if it remained in place. The Afrika Korps had fought valiantly, but the imbalance in strength and supply was overwhelming. The line at El Alamein was broken. Supercharge had achieved what Lightfoot had prepared: decisive victory. Operation Supercharge marked the turning point of the entire battle. What began as a grinding contest of attrition had now transformed into a breakthrough, with the 8th Army poised to drive Rommel's forces into retreat. The sacrifice of the infantry, the determination of the tank crews, and the relentless support of artillery and air power had combined to deliver victory. Montgomery's deliberate strategy had borne fruit by bleeding the Axis dry and concentrating his power at the decisive moment. He had broken their will and capacity to resist. The battlefield was a graveyard of Axis hopes, littered with the wreckage of their final stand. For the Allies, the breakthrough was not only military but symbolic, a demonstration that the Desert War had shifted irreversibly in their favor. The path ahead now lay open, stretching westward across North Africa. Supercharge had shattered the Axis at El Alamein. The battle was not over, but the outcome was now clear. The shattering force of Operation Supercharge left Rommel's Panzerarmee Afrika on the brink of destruction. The once proud formation, which had swept from Cyrenaica to the gates of Egypt, now staggered under the weight of losses. Tanks lay smouldering across the battlefield, artillery positions were overrun, and infantry battalions were reduced to shadows of their former strength. The Axis line at El Alamein, painstakingly fortified over months, had collapsed into fragments. For Rommel, the question was no longer how to hold, but how to save what remained of his army. Retreat was no longer a choice, it was a necessity. Yet in ordering withdrawal, Rommel faced the bitter reality of abandoning ground he had fought for with such determination. For the Germans, it was a strategic setback. For the Italians, it was disaster, as many of their divisions were too battered to escape. The Panzerarmee was no longer a striking force, it was a broken army, fleeing westward across the desert. The retreat began in chaos, as German and Italian units scrambled to disengage under constant Allied pressure. Convoys of trucks loaded with men and supplies sped westward, leaving behind wreckage and wounded. Tanks with enough fuel fell back in rearguard actions, while those immobilized by damage or empty fuel tanks were abandoned and destroyed to prevent capture. Italian infantry divisions lacking adequate transport were left particularly vulnerable. Many soldiers marched on foot across the desert, harassed by Allied air attacks and pursued by advancing armor. German officers tried to maintain order, but the withdrawal quickly became disorganized under the strain of continuous combat. The once disciplined Afrika Korps now resembled a desperate column of fugitives. Abandoning equipment, supplies, and even comrades was the price of survival. The retreat westward was not a maneuver of choice, but an act of desperation. Rommel's Panzerarmee was disintegrating in the face of Allied pursuit. The Italians bore the brunt of the collapse, their units suffering catastrophic losses. Entire divisions, such as the Trento and Ariete, were virtually annihilated during the withdrawal. Italian soldiers fought bravely, but lacked the mobility to escape or the weapons to resist Allied armor effectively. Many were surrounded and forced to surrender, swelling the number of Axis prisoners captured by the Eighth Army. Trucks that should have carried Italian infantry were prioritized for German units, deepening resentment within the alliance. Columns of exhausted Italian soldiers trudged across the sand, exposed to Allied airstrikes, and cut off by fast-moving British patrols. Some divisions disintegrated completely, their men scattering into the desert in search of survival. For Mussolini's forces, El Alamein marked not just defeat but humiliation. The Italians had been asked to hold against impossible odds, and in the retreat they paid the heaviest price. The collapse of the Panzer Army revealed the fragility of the Axis partnership in North Africa. German units, though battered, managed to execute more disciplined rearguard actions. Rommel's panzers, though few in number, fought delaying battles to slow the British pursuit. Well-trained German infantry covered withdrawals, setting ambushes and laying mines along the retreating routes. These actions bought time, allowing some units to escape the encirclement that Montgomery sought to impose. Yet every counterattack drained precious fuel and ammunition, leaving the rearguards increasingly vulnerable. Rommel's brilliance at improvisation was evident, but even he could not reverse the tide. His army was bleeding out, and every mile of desert crossed was won at enormous cost. The Afrika Korps was reduced to fragments of its former strength, clinging to survival. The German soldiers remained fierce opponents, but their numbers and resources dwindled with every passing day. Retreat had become the only strategy left. The British pursuit was relentless, spearheaded by fast-moving armoured columns and supported by artillery and air power. Montgomery's Eighth Army pressed forward cautiously but inexorably, determined to exploit the collapse without falling into traps. British armor surged across the desert, cutting off retreating Axis convoys and forcing engagements against rearguard positions. The RAF Desert Air Force dominated the skies, strafing convoys and bombing supply dumps with ruthless precision. Axis retreat routes became graveyards of burning trucks and shattered vehicles, littering the desert with the debris of a defeated army. Allied propaganda spoke of a desert chase, portraying the pursuit as the final unraveling of Rommel's legend. In reality, the fighting remained fierce, as German rearguards resisted stubbornly at every opportunity. Still, the momentum was unmistakably in Allied hands. The Eighth Army advanced westward, step by step, driving the Axis out of Egypt. The Desert War had turned decisively against the once dominant Afrika Korps. For the men of the Panzerarmee, the retreat was an ordeal of exhaustion and despair. Soldiers marched for days with little food or water, their uniforms torn and their bodies battered. Vehicles broke down constantly, leaving men stranded in the desert as convoys roared past. Wounded soldiers, unable to keep up, were often left behind, a grim necessity in the chaos of retreat. Allied aircraft circled overhead, their strafing runs a constant reminder that safety was an illusion. Prisoner columns grew with each passing day, as cut-off units surrendered rather than be annihilated. The psychological toll was immense, as soldiers who had once believed in Rommel's invincibility now faced the reality of collapse. German veterans spoke of El Alamein as the moment when hope died in the desert. Italian survivors carried memories of abandonment and betrayal. For both, the retreat was not merely a physical ordeal, but a shattering of morale. The Panzerarmee's collapse was complete in spirit as well as in strength. Rommel himself tried to impose order on the retreat, issuing orders to regroup at successive defensive positions further west. He hoped to stabilize his lines at Fuka, then Mersa Matruh, and later at the Libyan frontier. Yet Montgomery's pursuit, coupled with air superiority, prevented any meaningful consolidation. Each defensive stand crumbled under relentless assault before it could solidify. Rommel, once the master of desert maneuver, was now forced into a series of desperate withdrawals, reacting to Allied moves rather than dictating them. His ability to inspire remained, but his army no longer had the strength to execute bold maneuvers. Reports from the front grew increasingly grim: fuel shortages, mass surrenders, and collapsing morale. Rommel understood that his army was fighting for survival, not victory. The collapse of the Panzerarmee was not a single moment, but a rolling disaster, unfolding with every mile of retreat. By mid-November 1942, the Axis had been driven entirely out of Egypt. The pursuit across the desert left the Panzerarmee reduced to a battered remnant, retreating toward Libya with Montgomery in relentless pursuit. The Battle of El Alamein had ended in catastrophe for Rommel, his once proud army now shattered and fleeing. German and Italian units that had boasted of capturing Cairo now fought simply to escape annihilation. The desert floor was strewn with the wreckage of their defeat, a testament to the scale of the collapse. For the Allies, the pursuit was proof that the tide of war in North Africa had turned decisively. El Alamein was not just a victory, but the beginning of a relentless advance that would push the Axis across the entire continent. The Panzer Army Africa had collapsed, and with it, Hitler's dream of conquering the Middle East. The desert had consumed Rommel's army. The legend of the Desert Fox was now one of survival, not triumph. The victory at El Alamein was more than a tactical success. It marked the collapse of Axis ambitions in Egypt. For months, Rommel's forces had threatened Alexandria, the Nile, and even the Suez Canal, symbols of Britain's imperial lifeline. Now those dreams were extinguished. The Afrika Korps and their Italian allies, once hailed as conquerors of the desert, were reduced to battered remnants fleeing westward. The road to Cairo was closed, and the Suez Canal, vital to Allied shipping, was secured beyond threat. Mussolini's grand visions of riding triumphantly into the Egyptian capital vanished in the smoke of burning tanks. For the soldiers of the Eighth Army, the victory was a vindication of months of hardship, retreats, and bitter defeats. They had turned the tide in the desert, halting Rommel's advance once and for all. The psychological weight of the victory was immense. The Desert Fox had been beaten. The sands of El Alamein had become the graveyard of Axis hopes in Egypt. Rommel's retreat from Egypt was relentless, a forced march across hundreds of miles of desert toward Libya. His forces fell back to defensive positions at Fuka, then Mersa Matruh, but each crumbled under Montgomery's pursuit. The Eighth Army pressed forward with unyielding determination, driving the Axis across the barren sands with artillery and air power raining down at every step. Columns of German and Italian vehicles streamed westward, constantly harassed by Allied aircraft. The retreat was marked not by organized withdrawal, but by desperation, with units abandoning equipment and wounded to save themselves. Rommel fought delaying actions where possible, but his army was too weakened to mount serious resistance. The desert, once his ally, now seemed to conspire against him, stretching supply lines and exposing his troops to Allied attack. For the first time, the Desert Fox was no longer maneuvering by choice, but fleeing by necessity. Egypt was lost, and the retreat toward Tunisia had begun. The long chase westward would become a defining ordeal of the Desert War. The Italians suffered most heavily during this phase, their divisions reduced to shadows of their former strength. Many Italian soldiers, left without transport, were captured in their thousands by advancing Allied columns. Entire formations ceased to exist, their men trudging into captivity across the desert sands. German units, though better organized, also suffered terrible losses, with many tanks and guns abandoned for lack of fuel or destroyed to prevent capture. The once feared Panzerarmee Afrika was no longer a cohesive force, but a collection of shattered units clinging to survival. The retreat exposed the unequal partnership between Germans and Italians, with German formations given priority in transport and supplies. Italian bitterness simmered, while German contempt hardened further. Axis unity, fragile at the best of times, fractured completely under the strain of defeat. What had once been presented as a proud coalition was now unraveling. The retreat westward was not just a military collapse, but a political and alliance crisis. For Montgomery and the Eighth Army, the pursuit was measured but determined. Montgomery was not one to gamble recklessly or risk overextension, and he advanced cautiously to preserve his supply lines. Yet his strategy ensured that the Axis had no opportunity to regroup. Each time Rommel tried to establish a defensive stand, Montgomery brought his artillery and armor to bear, smashing the position before it could solidify. The RAF maintained air superiority, ensuring that Axis columns could find no respite. This relentless pressure turned retreat into rout, driving Rommel deeper into Libya. The Eighth Army, once in retreat across the same sands, now advanced with confidence and discipline. The soldiers who had endured Gazala and Tobruk now felt the momentum of victory at their backs. Their advance symbolized not only military success, but redemption. The Desert War had shifted irrevocably in their favor. The pursuit westward was the embodiment of momentum regained. Strategically, El Alamein marked a turning point in the global war. Churchill, upon hearing of the victory, famously declared, "This is not the end, it is not even the beginning of the end, but it is, perhaps, the end of the beginning." For Britain, battered by years of setbacks, El Alamein was a desperately needed triumph. It restored faith at home, reassured allies abroad, and sent a message to occupied nations that the tide was turning. For the Axis, the defeat shattered the aura of invincibility that had surrounded Rommel and the German army. Propaganda could not disguise the scale of the retreat or the loss of Egypt. Hitler, furious at the collapse, demanded that Rommel hold, but the reality of logistics and battlefield pressure made such orders impossible. El Alamein resonated far beyond the desert, shaping perceptions of the war's future. It was a victory of both arms and spirit, signaling that the Allies had seized the initiative. The world took notice. Even as Rommel retreated, a new dimension of the war was unfolding. On November 8, 1942, just days after El Alamein, Allied forces landed in Morocco and Algeria in Operation Torch. This opened a second front in North Africa, squeezing the axis between Montgomery's advancing 8th Army in the east and the newly arrived Anglo-American forces in the west. Rommel now faced not one enemy but two, his already shattered army caught in a tightening vice. The retreat toward Tunisia was no longer just a fallback, it was a race for survival. Axis hopes of holding North Africa diminished rapidly as Allied strength surged on both sides. The balance of the campaign had irreversibly shifted. El Alamein was the hammer blow, and Operation Torch was the anvil. Together, they doomed Axis control of North Africa. The strategic momentum now lay firmly with the Allies. For the men who had fought at El Alamein, the aftermath carried both triumph and tragedy. British, Australian, New Zealand, Indian, and South African soldiers celebrated the end of a long defensive struggle, their sacrifices vindicated by victory. Yet the cost was heavy, with thousands killed or wounded in the fighting for ridges, minefields, and strongpoints. The desert was littered with graves, marked by simple crosses that bore silent witness to the ferocity of the battle. Axis survivors, meanwhile, carried the scars of defeat, their morale shattered by relentless retreat and the loss of comrades. Prisoners marched into captivity spoke of hunger, exhaustion, and betrayal, especially among Italians who felt abandoned by their German allies. The aftermath of El Alamein was not only a strategic turning point, but a human story of suffering and resilience. The Desert Campaign had tested men to their limits, and its legacy would be measured in lives as much as victories. The sands held memories of both glory and grief. By the close of 1942, Rommel's once proud army had retreated across Libya, clinging to a final defensive line in Tunisia. The dream of Axis domination in the Middle East was dead, replaced by the grim reality of survival. The Allies had seized the initiative in North Africa, and momentum was now firmly theirs. El Alamein had ended the era of Axis advance and begun the long road of Allied conquest. From Cairo to London to Washington, the victory was hailed as proof that the Axis could be beaten on land. For the men of the 8th Army, it was vindication. For the Axis, it was the beginning of the end. Tunisia would be the last stand in North Africa, but the outcome was already written in the sands of El Alamein. The desert had spoken, and its verdict was final. The balance of the war in North Africa had shifted forever. El Alamein was the turning point. The victory at El Alamein reverberated across the Allied world like a thunderclap. For Britain, it was the first unambiguous land victory of the war against the Germans, coming after years of retreats, evacuations, and defeats. From Dunkirk to Tobruk, the story had too often been one of survival rather than triumph. Now at El Alamein, the narrative had changed. Churchill, ever the master of words, captured the moment with his famous declaration, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." The battle became a symbol, proof that the tide of war could be turned. Across London, people celebrated with relief and renewed confidence, feeling for the first time that victory was possible. For the troops, their hard-fought success was a vindication of sacrifice and endurance. The desert victory became a beacon of hope in a war still filled with uncertainty. El Alamein was more than a battle, it was a turning point in morale. The psychological boost extended far beyond Britain. Across the Commonwealth, soldiers and civilians alike saw El Alamein as vindication of their contributions to the war effort. Australian, New Zealand, South African and Indian troops had all played crucial roles in the desert campaign, and their sacrifices were now crowned with victory. In occupied Europe, news of the German defeat spread quietly but powerfully, undermining the myth of Nazi invincibility. In Washington, American leaders welcomed the victory as evidence that the Allies could win, even before large-scale US ground forces were committed. Moscow too took note, seeing El Alamein as part of a larger shift in fortunes, occurring just as the Red Army prepared its own counter-offensive at Stalingrad. For the Axis, the defeat was equally symbolic, exposing cracks in the facade of German and Italian military supremacy. Morale plummeted in Rome and Berlin as the news filtered back. El Alamein strategic consequences began with hearts and minds. Militarily, the victory transformed the balance of power in the Mediterranean. By securing Egypt and the Suez Canal, the Allies protected their vital lifeline to India, the Middle East, and the Far East. Shipping lanes through the canal, threatened for over a year, were now safe from Axis encroachment. This freed up resources and shortened supply routes, strengthening the Allied logistical base. Malta, already holding out as a besieged fortress, was now secure as a launching pad for attacks on Axis convoys. With El Alamein won, the Allies controlled the eastern Mediterranean, setting the stage for further advances. Axis hopes of linking up with forces pushing from the Caucasus were extinguished. The Mediterranean had been transformed from a contested theatre into one increasingly dominated by the Allies. El Alamein closed one door for the Axis, while opening many for the Allies. The battle's consequences reshaped the map of the region. The timing of El Alamein was crucial. Just days after Montgomery's breakthrough, the Allies launched Operation Torch, the Anglo-American landings in Morocco and Algeria. The two operations were not directly coordinated in a tactical sense, but strategically they dovetailed perfectly. El Alamein pinned Rommel's army in retreat, while Torch brought new Allied armies onto the continent from the west. Together they created a two-front pressure that the Axis could not withstand. Rommel's forces retreating from Egypt would soon be trapped between Montgomery's 8th Army and the Anglo-American forces advancing from Algeria. The German and Italian dream of dominating North Africa evaporated almost overnight. The Desert War, once an Axis opportunity, had become an Axis liability. Torch and El Alamein combined to seal the fate of the Panzerarmee Africa. In the larger story of the war, this was coordination by opportunity, and it worked with devastating effect. Strategically, El Alamein and Torch shifted the Mediterranean from defensive to offensive operations for the Allies. No longer fighting merely to hold, the Allies were now dictating the pace of the campaign. The Axis, once the aggressors, were reduced to fighting rearguard actions across Libya and into Tunisia. This reversal freed Allied planners to consider broader offensives, including invasions of Sicily and Italy. The Mediterranean became a springboard for Allied power, projecting strength into southern Europe. For the first time, the Allies had momentum on land in a major theatre of war. Axis forces, by contrast, faced dwindling resources, long supply lines, and increasing attrition. The initiative had passed decisively into Allied hands. El Alamein was not just a victory of the moment, it was the foundation of future campaigns. The Mediterranean was no longer in doubt. It was becoming an Allied lake. The global perception of the war shifted dramatically after El Alamein. Until then, Axis advances had seemed unstoppable, from Poland to France, from the Balkans to North Africa. Even in the Soviet Union, German armies were deep within the territory, pressing toward Stalingrad and the Caucasus. El Alamein demonstrated that the Axis could not only be halted but decisively beaten. It restored confidence among Allied populations, showing that discipline, planning, and overwhelming resources could overcome even the most formidable opponents. The victory also encouraged resistance movements across occupied Europe, who saw hope in the weakening of Axis power. Propaganda posters and broadcasts celebrated the Desert Triumph as proof of eventual liberation. In Berlin, however, the defeat was received with fury by Hitler, who refused to accept its implications. The myth of German invincibility was beginning to crumble. El Alamein's global impact lay in changing how the war was imagined. For Churchill and the British High Command, El Alamein was also a political triumph. After years of criticism over military setbacks, Churchill could now point to a clear and decisive victory. His gamble on Montgomery's cautious but methodical leadership had paid off. In Parliament he spoke of the battle with both humility and pride, acknowledging the sacrifice of soldiers while framing the victory as part of a greater struggle. For Roosevelt and the Americans, El Alamein reassured them that their British allies could be counted on to deliver results. The victory smoothed cooperation between the Allies, strengthening bonds at a critical moment before American forces became fully engaged in Europe. For Stalin, it was a sign that the Western Allies were contributing meaningfully to the fight against Germany. Politically and diplomatically, El Alamein mattered as much as it did militarily. It bolstered the credibility of the Allied coalition. The victory was shared, and its symbolism was global. El Alamein's strategic consequences cannot be overstated. It ended the Axis threat to Egypt, secured the Suez Canal, and safeguarded vital oil supplies in the Middle East. It shifted the Mediterranean theater from Axis opportunity to Allied springboard. It enabled Operation Torch and the eventual invasion of Italy, altering the trajectory of the European war. It boosted Allied morale worldwide while undermining Axis prestige. It marked the beginning of sustained Allied offensives, a rhythm of victories that would carry through to Tunisia, Sicily, and beyond. Churchill's words about the battle captured the essence of its legacy. El Alamein was not the end, nor even the beginning of the end, but it was the end of the beginning. The World War had entered a new phase. The Axis were on the defensive, and the Allies were on the march. El Alamein was the pivot on which the future turned. In the aftermath of El Alamein, Winston Churchill sought words to capture its importance, and he found them with characteristic brilliance. Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat. These words echoed far beyond the halls of Parliament, becoming immortal lines that defined not only a battle but an era. To Churchill, El Alamein was the pivot on which the fortunes of the Allies turned, the moment when despair gave way to hope. His declaration was both celebration and prophecy, setting the tone for how the battle would be remembered. For the soldiers who fought there, the words resonated as recognition of their sacrifice. For civilians back home, they became a rallying cry for perseverance. El Alamein was enshrined in memory not only as a military turning point, but as a cultural and psychological milestone. The Prime Minister's phrase would be repeated for generations, encapsulating the essence of victory in the desert. It was not just history, it was legacy forged in words. On the battlefield itself, memory was preserved in a more solemn form. The deserts of El Alamein became the resting place for thousands of soldiers from across the world. Commonwealth cemeteries, meticulously maintained, stretch across the landscape, rows of white headstones marking the sacrifice of Australians, New Zealanders, South Africans, Indians, and Britons. Each name tells a story of youth lost in the sands, of battles fought far from home. Italian memorials honor those who died in the service of Mussolini's ill-fated empire, while German cemeteries commemorate Rommel's soldiers who fought with determination against impossible odds. These memorials stand not in triumph, but in solemn remembrance. Pilgrims, veterans, and families still come to the desert, standing in silence before graves that symbolize the shared suffering of war. The silence of the desert amplifies their voices, reminding visitors of the cost of victory. In these cemeteries, the legacy of El Alamein is etched not in rhetoric but in stone. Memory lives here, in the stillness of the sands. The battlefield itself, once alive with fire and fury, has been preserved as a place of reflection. Museums and memorial centers now stand near El Alamein, displaying relics of the struggle, tanks, artillery pieces, uniforms, and personal effects. Visitors walk among the remnants, imagining the chaos that once filled the same desert expanse. Guides recount the stories of infantry assaults, armored clashes, and air duels that defined the battle. The sands that once drank the blood of thousands now serve as a vast open-air classroom for history. Veterans who returned often spoke of the eerie quiet, so different from the roar of guns they remembered. Yet even in silence, the battlefield speaks. Every ridge, every minefield, every ruined bunker is part of a larger story. El Alamein is no longer a place of war, but a shrine to memory. It ensures that the decisive clash of the desert is never forgotten. For historians, El Alamein has become a focal point of debate and analysis. Some argue that the battle was the true turning point of the Second World War, the first decisive Allied land victory against Germany. Others suggest that Stalingrad held greater significance, overshadowing the Desert Campaign. Yet what is undeniable is that El Alamein changed momentum and perception. It proved that the Axis could be defeated in open battle by a coordinated, well-supplied Allied force. Military scholars point to Montgomery's meticulous planning, the integration of air and ground power, and the overwhelming logistical advantage that secured victory. Critics note the slow and methodical approach, contrasting it with Rommel's daring maneuvers of earlier campaigns. But even critics cannot deny that El Alamein reshaped the war in North Africa and beyond. The desert victory remains a case study in strategy, leadership, and the decisive role of logistics. Its legacy in scholarship is as contested as it is enduring. El Alamein is also remembered through the lens of legend, particularly in the figure of Rommel. Despite his defeat, the Desert Fox retained a reputation for tactical brilliance and personal integrity. His adversaries, including Montgomery, often praised his skill, even as they fought to destroy his army. Rommel's name became entwined with El Alamein, not only as the general who lost, but as the commander who had come closest to conquering Egypt. For Italians, the battle symbolized sacrifice without recognition, their divisions broken and their valor overshadowed by German narratives. For the Commonwealth, El Alamein became a touchstone of identity, proof that distant nations could shape the outcome of a global war. Memory is never neutral. It is shaped by myth, narrative, and national pride. At El Alamein, each nation remembers differently, yet all remember the desert holds the stories of both victors and vanquished. Its legacy is shared even if its meanings diverge. In popular memory, El Alamein occupies a unique place. It has been immortalized in books, films, and documentaries, often presented as the quintessential desert battle. The imagery of tanks dueling amid dunes, soldiers advancing through minefields, and aircraft streaking across the sky has captured the imagination of generations. For veterans, these portrayals often simplified the brutal reality of the fight, yet they kept the story alive. School children learn of El Alamein as one of the pivotal battles of the Second World War, alongside Stalingrad, Normandy, and Midway. Museums across the world display artifacts from the battle, ensuring that the Desert War is not forgotten. Memorial ceremonies are held annually, where veterans once gathered to remember fallen comrades. As their numbers dwindled, the torch of memory passed to new generations. El Alamein, once a place of death, became a symbol of endurance and remembrance. Its story remains woven into the larger tapestry of the war's memory. Churchill's words ensured that El Alamein would forever be framed as a triumph of resilience. For the British people, weary of years of sacrifice, the battle was proof that perseverance would yield victory. For the Commonwealth, it was a reminder of their essential role in a global conflict. For the Axis, it was a lesson in the limits of ambition and the unforgiving nature of logistics in modern war. Today, military academies study the battle for its lessons in coordination, leadership, and the integration of arms. Politicians evoke its memory when speaking of unity and determination in the face of adversity. El Alamein is remembered not only for what happened there, but for what it symbolized. It was the desert's decisive battle, the moment the balance tipped. Its legacy endures in both history and imagination. El Alamein became not just a victory, but a symbol of how wars are turned. As the decades have passed, El Alamein has settled into history, but its legacy remains alive in memory and memorial. Veterans are gone, yet their stories endure in oral histories, museums, and the silence of cemeteries. The desert itself, vast and unforgiving, stands as a monument to the struggle. In the shifting sands, one can still trace the outlines of trenches, minefields, and tank tracks. For those who visit, El Alamein is not merely a battlefield, but a reminder of the human cost of war. Its memory carries both pride and sorrow, triumph and tragedy. The legacy of El Alamein is not only in victory, but in remembrance. It is a place where history and memory converge, where the past is preserved in the silence of the desert. The battle's echoes still linger, shaping how we understand the war. El Alamein remains, above all, the desert's decisive battle, forever etched in history.